Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere truly disgusting. So disgusting, in fact, you probably won't survive this. Emotionally, we're heading straight into the stench-ridden heart of 14th century Europe during one of the darkest, dirtiest times in human history, the Black Plague. It's not glamorous, it's not heroic, and absolutely nothing smells good. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I like to imagine the weird, sleepy places these stories end up. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step off a rickety wooden cart into the cramped, cobbled alleyways of 1347 Messina, Sicily. The wind smells like, well, let's say it's a complex bouquet. There's the sour sting of human waste, the iron tang of old blood, a hint of fish that's not just dead but deeply disrespected, and a top note of decomposing something or other. The sky's that yellow-grey colour that promises a headache, and you're already starting to regret your travel choices. There's no getting around it. This is not a clean place. A horse lumbers past, tail swatting fighters and deposits a steaming pile of exclamation point on the road. No one bats an eye. People just step around it in shoes that are basically leather pancakes. You, however, stop dead, gagging a little. This is your first clue. No one here really notices the filth anymore. The city's walls are patched together from stone, timber and stubbornness. The streets are more like narrow channels where people live, work, sleep and relieve themselves, sometimes all at once. Open gutters line the sides, and you quickly learn to keep your mouth shut when the breeze picks up. Every so often someone flings a bucket of something out a second-story window. If you're lucky, it's just dishwater. If you're not, well, let's not dwell. Most homes here are made of wood and crammed into tight, sunless rows. There's no plumbing, no proper sewage, and no trash collection. Waste is either dumped in the street or tossed into the river, which is the same river people use for drinking, washing clothes, and occasionally, if they're feeling fancy, bathing. The air is heavy, not just with heat, but with the kind of moisture that clings to your skin and your soul. People say it's the bad air, miasma, that causes disease, and honestly, you don't even argue. The smell alone could kill a Victorian. Everything rots faster in this world. Food, fabric, flesh is just a given. You pass a group of children playing in the mud, except it's not just mud. It's a slurry of soil, manure, ashes and mystery. But they're laughing, immune to the grime, their faces streaked with soot and joy. They don't know anything else. You, however, are still internally screaming. Now here's the historical fact to chew on while you try not to chew on the air. Medieval cities didn't have proper sewage systems until the 19th century. That's more than 400 years of marinating in their own situation. Instead, people relied on cesspits, holes in the ground where waste collected, until someone brave, and probably nose-blind, came to scoop it out. These pits were often dug dangerously close to wells. You can imagine how that worked out. Oh, and here's a quirky little gem. In some towns, residents paid a fee to a person whose actual job title was gong farmer. Their job? Empty cesspits by hand, at night, because it was considered too gross for daylight, even for medieval people. These folks made surprisingly good money, though at great cost to their social life and sense of smell. Now let's talk about that scholarly debate, because believe it or not, historians actually argue about how dirty medieval people really were. Some say that we've exaggerated the grossness for dramatic effect, especially thanks to Victorian historians who love to sneer at the past. They point to laws about street cleaning and public bathhouses as evidence that people tried. Others argue that those efforts were patchy at best and mostly symbolic, like hanging an air freshener in a barn. Let's just say both sides are right. There were attempts at cleanliness, yes, but they were no match for the overwhelming tide of urban life, livestock, disease and human inertia. A nearby butcher hacks at a carcass with a cleaver that hasn't seen soap in a month. Blood runs into the gutter and mingles with the rest of the city's fragrant cocktail. Dogs sniff around hopefully. The butcher wipes his hands on his apron, already red and crusty, and goes back to work without skipping a beat. You notice he has a bandage around one finger. It's not doing well. And that's the thing, this isn't a world with antiseptics, antibiotics, or even an understanding of germs. People think disease is spread by bad smells or divine punishment, not bacteria. That's why no one is panicking about cleanliness. They are worried about sin, bad air, and maybe a comet or two. Hygiene isn't a priority when the world seems random and cursed. The sun starts to set, casting the streets in a warm, deceiving glow. It almost looks cosy, if you ignore the rats scurrying from shadow to shadow like they own the place. Spoiler, they kind of do. You lean against a building which immediately feels like a mistake. You try not to wonder why. So here you are, in the middle of a bustling, plague-bound city, surrounded by people just doing their best with what they've got, which is mostly rags, bucketers, and denial. Everyone's trying to live normally while a pandemic creeps closer day by day. And the worst part? They don't even know how it spreads. They just know it kills. Fast. But hey, your journey's just begun. You haven't even met the plague doctors or smelled the perfume yet. There's still so much weird, wonderful filth to explore. So take a deep breath. Actually, don't. You wake up the next morning, if you can call what you just experienced sleep. It was more like an overnight truce with your anxious brain while it replayed every moist sound from the alley outside. Chickens clucked at impossible hours. A drunk guy yelled at the moon. And something, possibly a raccoon, possibly a demon, hissed right outside your wooden door. Welcome to the 14th century. You survived your first night. Gold star. You stumble out into the street, half expecting the smells to have magically disappeared. Nope. Still awful. And now the sun's up, so everything's warmed nicely into a rich broth of decay. The streets are bustling though. Merchants holler, dogs bark, children run barefoot through sludge, and everyone seems eerily used to the chaos. This for them is normal. Today's your day to explore the urban charm of medieval streets. If charm means a game of dodge the chamber pot. The alleys wind like drunk snakes, uneven and sticky underfoot. Trash piles up in corners where carts can't reach, and it's not just food scraps. You spot bones, cloth, old shoes, something that might be a dead cat, or just a very tired one, and a few mysterious bundles no one wants to poke. Let's talk logistics for a second. You're in a town that predates city planning. There's no centralised waste system, no zoning, and definitely no sanitation department. Instead, you've got horses, pigs, and the occasional goat sharing the streets with people. Livestock is everywhere because who wouldn't want to walk their cow through the marketplace during a plague? And here's your historical fact to chew on. Street cleaning in medieval towns was usually the job of regular citizens, not professionals. Once a week, maybe, everyone was supposed to sweep in front of their own house. That was the system. Just sweep with a broom, maybe throw down some straw to soak up the liquids. Naturally, it didn't work well. Some cities passed ordinances banning things like butchering animals in the streets or dumping waste out of windows. These were widely ignored. Which brings us to the bucket system. If you lived in a house without a proper privy, and most people did, you used a chamber pot. Basically a glorified bowl. When it filled up, you had two choices: carry it somewhere appropriate, or chuck it out the window. Most chose option B with a courteous yell of "Gardaloo" or some variation, to warn passers-by. If you heard that shout, you'd better move fast. Yes, Gardaloo was a real thing, and it's your quirky fact of the night. In Scotland and parts of England, it literally meant beware of the water, but spoiler, it wasn't water. It were pee, and other themed things. And if you were unlucky enough to walk under a second-story window at the wrong moment, congratulations, you just got medieval baptised. You watch a group of women walking along the edge of a street, lifting their skirts carefully to avoid stepping in something sinister. Their shoes are little more than leather soles tied with string. There's no such thing as waterproof boots. If the road's been recently cleaned, it's just wetter than usual. One of them slips and curses in a dialect that sounds like it's been chewed. No one helps her up. They just laugh and keep moving. There's a quiet, unspoken rule here. You deal with your own mess. As you round a corner, you're hit by the smell of something new, acrid, sharp. You follow it to a tanner's stall where animal hides hang like grotesque laundry. The tanner dunks them in vats of urine and lime to loosen the hair before scraping them clean. It's a disgusting process, and it's happening right in the open, in the middle of a busy street. No gloves, no masks, just hands, hides, and the worst smelling chemistry experiment of your life. And now we get to the open scholarly debate. Some historians argue that medieval cities weren't uniformly filthy. and that rural villages, monasteries or certain wealthy quarters were significantly cleaner. Others push back, saying that these clean pockets were exceptions, not rules, and that urban life, especially during plague years, was overwhelmed by sheer human volume and lack of infrastructure. So were people drowning in filth everywhere, or just in the popular parts of town? The answer, like everything in history, is messy. You duck into a small church for a moment of peace, hoping the air might be less offensive inside. It's quieter, yes, but the scent is musty. Mould clings to the stone walls, incense burns in a corner to cover the smells, but you can still catch the underlying bouquet of sweat, old wood and damp wool. Someone sneezes behind you. You flinch. On your way out, you pass a wooden cart filled with slop. It's headed to the edge of town where waste is dumped in pits or streams. The driver looks bored. This is just another Tuesday. You make a note not to follow that cart. You're not emotionally ready for whatever lies at its destination. You stop at a bakery next, drawn in by the one good smell you've encountered all day. Bread. Inside, it's warm and close. The baker, covered in flour and sweat, grins as he pulls out a round loaf. You notice his hands are filthy, like deeply, historically filthy. He hands you the bread anyway, and you realise you have two options. Eat and risk it, or starve in the world's worst smelling paradise. You take a bite, it's incredible, horribly made but delicious. You make peace with the dirt, kind of. Back outside, a sudden commotion turns heads. A man collapses in the road, clutching his chest. People gather, but no one touches him. They're already whispering the word, plague. You feel the crowd's fear shift the energy. It's subtle, but palpable. A few people make the sign of the cross, others back away. The stink suddenly seems more dangerous, like it carries invisible knives. A group of monks passes, holding cloths to their faces soaked in vinegar. You'll learn more about that in time, but for now, it just looks dramatic. They chant as they go, eyes focused ahead. The man in the street groans, and then stops moving. No one dares go near him. He'll be collected later. Maybe. As dusk creeps in again, you realize something odd. Your nose is adapting. The smells aren't gone, but your brain is beginning to file them under background horror. It's not normal, but it's becoming familiar. Still, the streets of stink have only just begun to tell their story. Tomorrow you'll meet people who think bathing is a terrible, terrible idea. But for now, try to drift off to sleep with the soft clatter of hooves and a faint aroma of toasted bread and horse droppings. You wake to church bells and shouting. Again. No alarm clocks here, just the sound of a donkey refusing to move, a baby wailing like it knows how bad the 1300s are, and someone trying to sell onions by yelling, "Onions!" with a voice that could peel paint. It's another fine morning in plague-era Europe, and your room, if you can call this splintery broom closet a room, smells like damp hay and the kind of mildew that has ambitions. You stretch, crack your back in at least 3 places, and step into your 3rd day of medieval hygiene awareness training. Your mission today, understand why bathing, one of the few things that might actually make a person feel semi-human, was considered either wildly suspicious or downright dangerous. That's right. In this upside-down world, soap is shady, water is worse, and the bathtub? Oh, that's basically a crime scene. Let's start with your first stop, a public bathhouse, or rather, what's left of it. You find it tucked between 2 leaning houses, a sagging wooden sign swinging above the door, showing a naked figure in a tub and some oddly sensual steam. Inside it's dim, smoky, and humid. Very few windows. It smells of boiled herbs, old sweat, and ambition. There are tubs lined up along one wall, filled with cloudy water that was probably cleaned sometime last week. Now for your historical fact of the day. Public bathhouses were incredibly popular in medieval Europe. At first. In fact, before the plague really took hold, communal bathing was a social event. Men and women bathed together in some towns. Scandalous. And bathhouses often doubled as places to gossip, relax, eat, and sometimes do things that made the church really uncomfortable, which leads us to the downfall of the bathhouse. When the Black Death started tearing through Europe, people got suspicious. Not of rats or fleas. Oh no, that would have made sense. They were suspicious of water, specifically warm water. The theory was that heat opened your skin's pores, letting the miasma, bad air full of disease supposedly, seep right in. Better to stay dirty and alive than clean and dead, they figured. And honestly, given the odds, it's hard to blame them. This belief wasn't pulled out of nowhere. It came from centuries of humoral theory, that whole medieval idea that your health depended on balancing bodily fluids. Opening up your pores, that could throw off your humours. It might even invite demons if you were especially unlucky. So yeah, the next time someone says they're skipping a shower for their health, just smile and know they've got 14th century backup. You talk to the bathhouse keeper, a wiry man named Emile who's seen better decades. He insists his water is almost fresh and gestures to a stack of towels that look like they've been chewed on by goats. You decline the bath. He shrugs like that's your loss. A woman nearby sits soaking with a dazed look on her face. Her hair is matted, but her expression says she hasn't felt warm in weeks. You feel a flicker of envy, and then a fleck of something lands in your eye. You leave. Out in the street you ask around. How often do people bathe? Most folks laugh. Some say once a month if they're fancy, others say once a season. A few proudly claim they've never had a proper bath in their lives, and that's why they've stayed healthy. You realise that here, stink isn't shameful, it's practically armour. Here's your quirky fact. Some medieval people believed that wearing the same dirty clothes over and over actually protected them from illness. The layer of grime created a kind of second skin that kept the miasma out. Basically, they thought filth was a filter. Like an organic medieval N95 mask made of armpits and crust. You can't make this stuff up. But there's a fascinating twist. Not everyone rejected bathing. Monasteries, for example, often had strict rules about cleanliness. Some monks bathed weekly or even more often, believing that cleanliness honoured God. Of course, this meant you needed access to water, labour and time, luxuries many didn't have. In cities, water had to be hauled in or scooped from wells, heated over a fire and poured into heavy tubs. It was work. Bathing wasn't just rare, it was exhausting. This brings us to the open debate. Historians still argue about how common bathing truly was. Some claim that medieval people weren't as dirty as we think, pointing to bathhouse records, soap recipes, and etiquette guides that emphasised hand-washing and hair care. Others argue that these examples represent the elite, not the average peasant or city dweller. So were they all crusty, or just the majority? The answer, as usual, is, it depends, on location, class, season, and how close the plague was that week. You pass a young woman rinsing her hands in a basin outside her home. She nods politely, then dries them on her dress. No soap in sight. Her family is preparing for dinner, turnips and something brown, and she waves you off before going inside. Washing before meals was advised, sure, but washing with soap, that's another story. Speaking of which, you'll learn later what medieval soap was made of, and trust me, you won't be thrilled. But for now, you head toward the river. No, it's one of the few public spaces where people still try to clean themselves, even if the water's shared by laundry, livestock, and a dead fish or three. A man crouches at the edge, scrubbing his face with a rock that looks like it's seen better lifetimes. A woman beside him dips a cloth in the water and wrings it over her head. She's probably cleaner now than anyone else you've seen all day, and yet she still smells like damp wool and onions. You pause, watching as kids splash nearby, laughing. It's oddly peaceful, until a cow wanders into the shallows and relieves itself. Everyone sighs, moves downstream, and continues as if nothing happened. Because honestly, this is just life. You don't stop living because it's gross. You adapt. The sun begins to set and the city breathes a little slower. You walk back toward your rented hovel, feeling like you've learned something that can't be unlearned. That cleanliness here isn't a priority. It's a luxury, a risk, a gamble. And yet somehow people still smile. They sing, they fall in love. Even covered in weeks of sweat and soot, humanity pushes on. It's kind of beautiful. In a grimy, smelly, totally unsanitary way. So sleep tight tonight. Knowing that your ancestors might have considered your daily shower suspicious, just imagine telling them about loofahs and body wash. They'd think you were a wizard, a weird, overly damp wizard. It's your 4th day in medieval Europe, and by now, you're growing disturbingly used to the way everything sticks to everything else. Your boots squelch with each step, the air is thick like it's been wrung out of a sponge, and every passing breeze seems personally targeted to carry a whiff of something you'll wish you never smelled. Still, you soldier on, because tonight's question is one you've definitely been too polite to ask out loud. Where did everyone go to the bathroom? The short answer is, wherever they could. The long answer is what we're getting into tonight. Let's start with the fancy folks. If you're lucky enough to be rich or live in a monastery, you might have access to what's called a garderobe, essentially a wooden seat over a vertical shaft that goes straight down the side of the building. You sit, you go, and gravity does the rest. The waste might drop into a pit, a moat, or a helpful river below. Congratulations! You've invented vertical plumbing, kind of. But don't get too impressed. These things often backed up, overflowed, or just reeked up the entire building. In winter, they were freezing. In summer, they were alive. So yes, noble bottoms had their own place to perch, but it was still far from luxurious. Some castles even had what they called garderobe towers, poop balconies essentially, built right into the walls. If you were walking beneath one at the wrong time, well, you just learnt to look up. Now, let's bring things back down to street level, literally. If you were an average townsperson or peasant, the options were a lot grimmer. Some houses had cesspits dug in the backyard, deep nasty holes that acted like DIY sewers. They'd fill up over time and had to be cleaned out by gong farmers, those brave, wretched souls whose job it was to scoop and cart off the contents. Always at night, always by hand, and always while everyone else tried not to make eye contact. For most people, the sphere, it was chamber pots all the way. These were ceramic or metal bowls tucked under the bed or in a corner. At night, you did your business into the pot, and in the morning someone, usually the youngest or the least respected person in the household, would take it out and dispose of it. Proper disposal in theory meant emptying it into a designated pit or stream. In practice, it meant flinging it out the window with a quick yell of warning. That's right. In cities like London and Paris, narrow alleys became impromptu bathroom zones. People developed a sixth sense for walking close to buildings, eyes up, always ready to dodge airborne danger. And if it rained, the streets became soup. Here's your historical fact of the night. It wasn't until the 14th century that some European cities began installing rudimentary drainage systems, but they weren't designed for human waste. They were for storm runoff and overflow from crowded wells. Waste still went wherever people could toss it. Some cities passed ordinances banning street dumping, but enforcement was spotty. There were just too many people, too much waste, and not nearly enough political will to stand between a tired mother and a full chamber pot. Now for your quirky fact, and this one's a treat. In some places, people believed that relieving yourself near a tree would make it barren, or that using certain latrines would invite evil spirits to crawl up and say hello. So yes, some folks avoided specific bathrooms because they thought the devil lived in the pit. You can't unknow that. As you walk through the marketplace, the evidence is everywhere. There's a soggy corner where several pots must have been dumped recently. Flies buzz in thick little tornadoes. A toddler squats against a wall like it's no big deal, because it isn't. This is normal. No one flinches, no one scolds him. If anything, people look at you funny for looking shocked. You duck into a tavern, not for food, but to investigate how things work in there. Turns out they don't. There's no bathroom, just a back alley that seems to be unofficially designated for, well, everything. A few barrels line the wall, each reeking in its own special way. The owner shrugs when you ask. "Just go where the pigs go," he says, laughing like he's made the world's funniest joke. You're not laughing. The thing is, pigs really are part of the system here. In many towns, they are allowed to roam freely through the streets, acting as the medieval garbage disposals. They eat food scraps, spoiled meat, and yes, human waste. It's horrifying and vaguely brilliant. Of course, it also means that half the animals in town are riddled with disease. But hey, circle of life. Here's where we pause for the scholarly debate of the evening. Some researchers argue that medieval sanitation wasn't quite as catastrophic as it sounds. They point to bylaws, city inspectors, and evidence of waste management plans. Others, probably with stronger noses, say that most of these rules were ignored or only enforced sporadically. A law against throwing waste out a window means nothing if you have no other option. So while the idea of cleanliness existed, the reality was a lot murkier. Literally. You head toward the edge of town now, curious about how things are handled in more rural areas. Along the way, you pass fields that double as outhouses. There's no privacy, just tall grass and good timing. A man tips his hat to you as he walks back from one such patch, wiping his hands on his tunic. You wave awkwardly, he grins. "Nothing like fresh air," he says. Eventually you reach a shallow stream where several women are washing clothes. It's hard work. They kneel on stones, scrubbing with ash soap and boards while kids splash nearby. One woman pauses to relieve herself in a bush, then returns to her washing without missing a beat. The divide between public and private, clean and dirty, just doesn't exist the way you're used to. Everything overlaps. Life is messier here, more immediate. The sun starts to dip again, casting long shadows over a town that never really stops moving. You wander back toward your lodging, stepping carefully around puddles that probably aren't water. There's a rhythm to it all, a grimy, earthy rhythm. It's not elegant, it's not sanitary, but it works in its own weird way. You fall asleep that night wondering how anyone survived this. Not just the plague, but the daily grind of grime and bodily functions and constant cloying odour. But they did. They raised families. They wrote poetry. They built cathedrals, all while ankle deep in things we flush without a second thought. So next time you sit on a porcelain throne and check your phone in peace, maybe whisper a quiet thanks to your medieval ancestors. They walked so you could scroll. You know how you've been kind of mentally bracing for the next layer of awful this whole time? Like you're already living in a historical fever dream of stink, slime and airborne regret, and yet part of you still whispers, it can get worse. Well, congratulations. Today we're talking about hand hygiene in the Black Plague era, which is to say the total and utter lack of it. You've spent enough time here now to know that cleanliness isn't a priority, but there's a special kind of horror that comes from watching people go about their daily lives with hands that haven't been introduced to soap in, ever. You start the day in the town square, where vendors are setting up their stalls. A butcher carves meat directly onto a filthy plank of wood. His hands are glistening, absolutely coated in grease, blood, and maybe someone's fingernail. He pauses to blow his nose into his hand, and wipes it casually on his apron, before handing a customer a dripping slab of pork. You watch the transaction with a rising wave of internal screaming. The customer doesn't even blink. They tuck the meat into a cloth and move on like this is perfectly fine, because to them, it is. Here's your historical fact of the day. People in the 14th century didn't know what germs were. The entire concept of invisible pathogens wouldn't become popular until several centuries later, when microscopes and people like Louis Pasteur changed the game. Until then, the dominant theories were all about bad smells, unbalanced humours, or divine punishment. So no one's scrubbing their hands after going to the bathroom, handling food, or burying the dead, because they don't think it matters. And if you're now thinking, surely there were some folks who washed their hands just out of sheer human instinct, you're not wrong. Hand washing did exist, it just wasn't what you're picturing. Wealthier folks might rinse their hands before meals as part of a ceremonial process. A servant pours lukewarm water from a pitcher over their hands while they hold them over a basin. No soap, no scrubbing, just a polite rinse so they could pretend they weren't about to eat with fingers that had been scratching, picking and touching all sorts of unspeakable things. Meanwhile, most commoners didn't bother. Water was a pain to haul, heat and use, and no one had time to waste on what seemed like a useless ritual. You ask a local cobbler if he washes his hands before eating. He laughs so hard he nearly chokes on a piece of bread, which he immediately offers you. You decline. Your quirky fact for tonight is a real treat. In some parts of Europe, people believed that rubbing crushed herbs or even raw onions on your hands could clean them. The idea was that strong smells would drive off disease, not just from your surroundings, but from your skin. So yes, medieval people sometimes walked around smelling like salad just to avoid getting sick. You pass a man who reeks of rosemary and garlic and looks very pleased with himself. He clutches a cloth over his nose like he's warding off demons. He probably thinks you're the weird one. You make your way toward the baker's shop again, the one with the suspiciously delicious bread, and decide to watch more closely this time. The baker kneads dough with the same hands he used to sweep ash from the hearth. He sneezes mid-fold, wipes his nose on his forearm and keeps going. You don't see any hand-washing station, not even a bowl, and yet the bread smells incredible. You experience the true tragedy of the medieval experience, the constant conflict between your nose and your better judgment. There's another layer to all of this. You visit a small monastery at the edge of town thinking maybe, just maybe, you'll find better hygiene habits there. Monks were supposed to be clean, right? Kind of. This particular order believes in ritual washing. Before prayers and meals, they rinse their hands in a communal basin. Soap is made from lye and animal fat and used sparingly. You watch as a monk dips his hands in, murmurs a prayer, and dries them on a shared cloth hanging from a peg. It's something. Better than nothing, but still not even remotely clean by modern standards. As you wander the hallways, a young monk tells you they clean the floors with straw and vinegar twice a week. This is considered excessive. He beams with pride. You nod politely while trying not to notice that his nails are black with dirt. Honestly, it's almost charming. Now let's wade into the scholarly debate. Some historians argue that our assumptions about medieval hygiene are exaggerated, that people did wash when they could, and that chronicling them as filth goblins is unfair and classist. Others point out that most of the population had no access to consistent water sources, didn't own soap, and lived in conditions that made hand washing either impossible or irrelevant. The truth likely sits somewhere in between. People wanted to be clean, but they didn't have the tools, the knowledge, or frankly the plumbing. You stop to watch a family eat dinner outdoors. The father cuts cheese with a knife that's seen no cleaning since breakfast. He passes chunks of bread around, and everyone eats with their fingers. A toddler drops his food into a puddle and picks it up without hesitation. You feel your stomach clench. The mother wipes the toddler's face with the corner of her apron, then immediately uses the same fabric to dry her hands. You're impressed and horrified in equal measure. And then there's the plague. As more people start coughing, limping, or just not showing up, fear thickens the air like smoke. You'd think that rising death rates would push people to be more cautious, but no, most responses lean into superstition or panic. One woman rubs vinegar on her hands obsessively, convinced it will keep the sickness away. Another carries a pouch of camphor and keeps her hands wrapped in cloth at all times, but none of them are washing. Not really. You end the day by watching a gravedigger finish his shift. He wipes his hands on his tunic after handling a body, shrugs, and walks into a tavern. You follow from a distance, too mentally exhausted to say anything. The past is a different country, and in this one, hand washing just never caught on. Still, people endure, they joke, they love, they offer you bread with fingers that probably pet a diseased goat 10 minutes ago, and somehow, some of them live long enough to see another day. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, let your fingers curl around your soft, warm blanket. Maybe smile at the thought of your modern soap pump, your antibacterial gel, and the sweet, sweet relief of not having to worry that your food came with a side of plague-infected fingerprints. You're starting to get used to the stink. That's not a good thing, it's just a fact. Your brain has filed it under ambient, the same way you eventually stop noticing the buzz of a fluorescent light or the drip of a leaky faucet. Congratulations, you've acclimated to the scent of a 14th century city. You're now officially nose-blind to old sweat, bad decisions, and public waste. Which is helpful, because today's adventure brings us to a whole new frontier of filth. Clothing hygiene. Or, more specifically, the lack of it. You've seen the outfits by now. Tunics, cloaks, woolen dresses, linen shifts, layers on layers of fabric, all heavy, all scratchy, and all desperately overdue for a wash. But here's the fun part. Most of these garments haven't been cleaned in weeks, months even. In some cases, not at all. You're surrounded by walking, talking piles of fabric held together with pins, string, and sheer willpower. And the scent? Oh, it's baked in. You start the day in the laundry quarter, which is exactly what it sounds like. A cluster of families beating the life out of clothing beside a river. Women bend over wooden boards, scrubbing until their knuckles are raw, dunking tunics into brownish water, wringing them out, and slapping them on rocks like they're trying to banish demons. There's no detergent, just ash soap and lye, both of which are abrasive enough to remove dirt, colour, and a few years of fabric lifespan all in one go. Your historical fact for the night is simple and tragic. Most people only owned 1 or 2 full sets of clothing, maybe 3 if they were lucky or had rich cousins. That means they wore the same shirt, the same underclothes, and the same outer layers day in, day out. Washing was an ordeal, water had to be fetched, soap was homemade, and drying could take days. So naturally, most people put it off as long as humanly possible. You follow a woman named Brigitte, who's washing her family's linens. She tells you they clean everything when the moon is full and the stains begin to speak. You think she's joking. She is not. Her hands are red from the lye, and her arms are corded with muscle from a lifetime of scrubbing. She says some townspeople believe washing clothes too often makes you more vulnerable to illness, opens up your body to bad air. Clean shirt, weak sprit, she says, nodding solemnly. You try not to look directly at the pair of breeches she's hanging to dry, because they are deeply haunted. As you walk through town, you start paying closer attention to people's clothes. You realise that texture has a smell. That colour doesn't mean anything anymore. Everyone wears shades of brown, grey, and what you can only describe as defeated beige. Patterns are rare, and embroidery even rarer. Rich folk flaunt coloured silks, of course, but even those begin to reek with time. Perfume helps a little, but not enough. And speaking of perfume, we'll get there. Later. For now, let's just sit with the knowledge that clothing in the Middle Ages was essentially a second skin, one you didn't remove until it was disintegrating or you were dead. Some people even got buried in their best clothes because they had no other set. Now here's your quirky fact. Lice was such a constant part of life that people had special combs just for picking them out of their clothes. Not their hair, their clothes. Shirts and undergarments were crawling with the little critters. It was so normal, people would casually pinch a louse between their fingernails mid-conversation, flick it away and carry on. You saw a man do it today while selling onions. Just snapped a flea between his thumb and forefinger like it owed him money. Didn't even break eye contact. Back to laundry. You pass a row of tunics strung on a rope between two buildings. They flap gently in the wind, dripping mysterious liquids onto the cobblestones below. A cat watches from a windowsill, looking as sceptical as you feel. You spot a shirt with holes so large you could fit your arm through the side. It's been patched, repatched, and finally just given up. People didn't throw clothes out unless they absolutely couldn't be salvaged. Fabric was expensive, every inch counted. Some folks didn't even own undergarments, just outer clothes, and maybe a scrap of cloth for modesty. If you were a woman, you might wear a chemise under your gown, but it'd be the only barrier between your skin and a whole lot of wool. If you were a man, you might own a pair of brays, basically medieval boxer shorts, which you'd wear until they were more whole than fabric. Washing those? Rare. You just aired them out and hoped for the best. Let's pause for the scholarly debate. Some historians believe the stereotype of filthy medieval people is exaggerated, that many folks did take pride in staying clean when they could, and that laundry was more frequent in cities with access to water. They cite records of laundresses employed by wealthy households, laws about not dumping wash water into the streets, and even clothing ordinances that required people to wear presentable garments in public. Others argue that these examples reflect the top 1% and that most people were just doing damage control, keeping stains to a dull raw and lice to a minimum. You find a small merchant who sells pre-washed garments. It's a scam. The clothes are damp, yes, but washed? Debatable. They smell like someone tried to mask mildew with crushed thyme. Still, a young couple buys a tunic and a shift, clearly excited by the prospect of new old clothes. They take them home like trophies. You wander back to your alley as twilight settles in, watching townsfolk prepare for bed. A man hangs his cloak on a nail beside his door. A woman beats dust out of her apron. Children tumble indoors wearing the same outfits they slept in last night and the night before. You're not sure anyone changes clothes unless there's a funeral, a wedding, or a fire. You peel off your own borrowed tunic and stare at it. It smells like wood smoke, anxiety, and other people's decisions. You fold it anyway and lay it beside your straw mattress. You've been in this time period long enough to know that the alternative is worse. As you settle in for the night, a rat skitters past and a moth the size of a small sandwich thuds against the wall. You sigh, tuck yourself into a rough wool blanket and drift off, surrounded by the soft rustle of unwashable linen and the quiet dignity of a population that decided, as a group, that clothing was optional when it came to cleanliness. The smell of something vaguely burning wakes you before sunrise, again. It's not a fire, thankfully, and just someone roasting questionable meat over an open flame with all the enthusiasm of someone who has absolutely no idea what they're cooking. You pull on your tunic, which is now both familiar and emotionally damaging, and shuffle outside. The air is heavy with wood smoke, wet stone, and that underlying funk you've started calling Eau de 1348. You take a deep breath, if regret it, and move on. Today's mission is surprisingly intimate and undeniably gross. We're talking medieval dental hygiene, or the near total lack thereof, because while everyone around you is trying to survive plague, famine, and the general chaos of history, they're also doing it with a mouthful of crumbling enamel and some of the worst breath imaginable. Your first encounter is with a local baker who offers you a piece of rock-hard bread, so hard in fact that you suspect it could be classified as a weapon in some regions. He bites into it like it's nothing, revealing teeth that are, charitably, unpredictable. Some are sharp, some are jagged, some just aren't there. He flashes a gap-toothed grin and offers you a bite. You politely decline. He shrugs and chomps again, unbothered. Let's start with the basics. Your historical fact tonight. Medieval people did have toothbrushes. Kind of. They used twigs. No, really. Chew sticks, often made from hazel, birch or other soft woods, were frayed at the ends and rubbed across the teeth. Sometimes they were soaked in herbs like mint or sage to freshen the breath, or at least distract from it. Did it work? Marginally, at best, bad. But in a world where oral care was more superstition than science, it was better than nothing. You wander through the open market and pause near a barrel where a woman is selling homemade tooth powder. She proudly tells you it's a blend of burnt rosemary, salt and powdered hooves. You nod politely as she hands you a pinch to try. Against your better judgment, you rub some on your teeth. It tastes like campfire and lies. She grins, revealing teeth that could file wood. You're not sure it helped. Now for the quirky fact you'll wish you didn't know. Some medieval toothpaste recipes included powdered bone, charcoal, and even crushed oyster shells. That's right, they were scrubbing their teeth with seafood gravel. And if that doesn't send shivers down your spine, just imagine the gum damage. Some formulas also included wine or vinegar to give it a cleansing sting, which is really just a nice way of saying, please enjoy your daily mouth injuries. You peek into a barber surgeon's tent next, curious to see how they handle dental issues. The short answer? Pliers. No sterilisation, no numbing, no gentle bedside manner, just a guy with a strong grip and no hesitation. You watch him extract a molar from a very drunk man who's too far gone to notice that the blood is spraying in an arc. The pliers look like they were used on horses yesterday, or possibly are meant for horses. Here's the thing, toothaches were a serious problem, and if a tooth went bad, the solution wasn't to clean it, it was to rip it out. People went to barbers, blacksmiths, anyone with a firm hand and enough alcohol to get through the moment. There were no fillings, no root canals, and certainly no fluoride. You either pulled the tooth or lived with the pain until it killed you or drove you mad. You wander back into town and notice something else. Everyone is chewing, on sticks, on roots, on cloves, on anything that might mask the rot. Breath fresheners were a thing, in the same way setting a scented candle in a burning building is technically a thing. Chewing parsley or fennel was common, and some people even believed cloves could ward off the plague. You watch a man tuck one behind his ear and another under his tongue, then sneeze violently to It's a charming ritual, and completely ineffective. This brings us to an open scholarly debate. Some historians argue that people in the Middle Ages didn't actually have such terrible teeth, at least compared to later centuries. Sugar wasn't yet widespread, and diets were more natural: grain, cheese, root vegetables, and meat. Fewer processed added carbs meant fewer cavities. Others point out that while the sugar content may have been lower, the abrasiveness of their tooth care and the complete absence of real dental medicine still led to horrific decay, infections, and chronic pain. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Fewer cavities, but a lot more untreated trauma. You sit with a group of children sharing a piece of fruit. One kid is missing both front teeth. Too young to have lost them to rot, probably, but old enough to be aware that no one's coming to help with the next set. An older girl leans over and pokes a tooth abscess on her brother's gum with a stick. He winces. She shrugs. You make a silent promise never to eat again. And then there are the superstitions. Some people believe toothaches were caused by toothworms. Yes. Tiny, invisible worms living inside your teeth, gnawing their way through the enamel. There are records of treatments that involved smoking out the worm, literally blowing herbs or incense into the mouth and hoping to chase it out. Spoiler, it never worked, but it made for some wildly theatrical dental procedures. As you wander toward the edge of town, you pass a small shrine dedicated to St. Apollonia, the patron saint of dentistry. People have left teeth at the base of her statue. Actual teeth. Some still streaked with blood. You take one respectful step back, then two more for good measure. The sun sets over another plague-shadowed town and the air grows cooler. People retreat into their homes, rubbing their jaws, chewing herbs, and accepting that tomorrow might bring another lost tooth or a visit to the barber with the wine jug and the pliers. No one complains. Pain is part of life here. You endure it or you don't. You crawl into bed, on your straw mattress, next to your now painfully familiar tunic, and stare at the ceiling. You run your tongue along your modern, mostly intact teeth and say a quiet thank you to whoever decided dental care should be a thing. Tomorrow brings new horrors, but for tonight, You close your eyes with the deeply sobering thought that the people around you are surviving war, plague, and hunger, or without floss. You wake up to bells again, but this time they're different. Slower, heavier. Each toll drags through the air like a warning, and when you step outside, the street is quieter than usual. People aren't shouting, no one's selling onions. Even the pigs seem subdued, their little snouts twitching at the still rotten air. And then you see him, a man in a bird mask striding slowly down the street like death in cosplay. This, finally, is your long-awaited introduction to the infamous Plague Doctor. You've seen the drawings, tall figure, black cloak, beaked mask like some nightmarish raven, but up close it's so much worse. He's not terrifying because he's evil, he's terrifying because he's trying. He honestly thinks he's helping, and maybe, by the standards of 1348, he is. You follow him from a distance, trying not to breathe too deeply. His mask juts out like a leather question mark, and he walks with a slow, steady rhythm, pausing every now and then to knock on doors or lean in close to whisper something behind the beak. He carries a cane, part walking stick, part pointer, part please don't touch me stick. He taps the ground like he's blind, or like the earth itself might betray him. Let's break down the outfit, starting with that infamous bird mask. Your historical fact tonight. The beaked mask was designed to hold sweet-smelling herbs, like lavender, myrrh, or mint, to filter out the bad air, miasma, that people believed carried disease. Inside the beak were sponges soaked in vinegar, or balls of aromatic resin, or dried flowers. In theory, this created a protective scent barrier between the doctor and the plague. In practice, it was a weird mix of aromatherapy and wishful thinking. The rest of the outfit was just as strange. A long waxed coat, often made of leather or canvas, was meant to keep fluids off the skin. Gloves and boots sealed the body like a medieval hazmat suit. The eyes of the mask were covered in glass or crystal lenses, giving the wearer an eerie insect-like appearance. To 14th century eyes, he probably looked powerful. To yours, he looks like the final boss of a haunted apothecary. You catch up to him as he enters a narrow home, ducking through the crooked doorway. You follow, peering in from behind a warped wooden shutter. Inside, a woman lies on a bed of rags, her skin pale and slick with sweat. Black blotches mar her neck. Buboes swell at her armpits and groin, those telltale, terrifying lumps. Her breathing rattles like a dying bellows. The doctor leans over her, not touching, just watching. He murmurs to someone in the shadows, maybe a family member, maybe another patient. Then he opens a pouch and pulls out a concoction, possibly dried figs, possibly old bread, possibly lies. He grinds it in a mortar, mixes it with wine, and offers it to the woman. She doesn't take it. Her eyes have already glazed. Here's your quirky fact. Plague doctors were often not real doctors at all. Many were hired by cities as a last resort. Sometimes they were failed physicians, low-ranking surgeons, or even opportunists with no medical training. Their main job wasn't healing, it was record-keeping and body counting. They documented the dead, sometimes performed autopsies, read guesswork with knives, and occasionally acted as mediators between the sick and the authorities. You watch the doctor leave the house, pausing just long enough to mark something on the door, a crude symbol of infection. Another home lost. Another family isolated. He doesn't linger. His steps crunch softly on the dirt road, and you can't help but feel a weird mix of awe and pity. He's doing what he can, wrapped in superstition and leather, trying to make sense of a nightmare without any of the tools that might actually help. This brings us to the scholarly debate of the day. Some argue that the iconic Plague Doctor look wasn't actually common during the Black Death of the 1340s, but appeared more prominently during later outbreaks in the 1600s. There's plenty of artwork from the Renaissance and Baroque periods that show the beak mask, but very little from the 14th century. So were these guys around during the original pandemic? Or are we projecting backwards? The jury's still out. It's possible they existed in some form, but the full leather bird suit may have been a later addition to the nightmare. Still, someone like this was walking these streets. Whether they wore the mask or not, plague doctors, whatever form they took, became symbolic of both hope and horror. They were feared and respected, mocked and admired. People clung to their presence, even when their treatments ranged from useless to outright harmful. You follow one now as he stops to speak to a group of townsfolk. They ask questions. Is it spreading? Will she survive? Is it the punishment of God? He answers with vague reassurances and references to purifying the air. He hands out herbal sachets like they're magic beans. A man thanks him, coughing into his sleeve. The doctor takes a step back, taps the ground with his cane and walks on. Behind him, a child sneezes. Her mother pulls her close. You sit for a while on the edge of a well, watching the street grow darker as shadows stretch. The doctor disappears into the dusk, one black figure among many. People hurry home, pulling scarves over their faces, lighting candles, muttering prayers. Fear is a smell here. Pungent and sour. It clings to everything. You think about the modern world, about masks and gloves and clean hospitals, about vaccines and science and doctors who don't wear beaks. And then you think about this man doing his rounds with a stick, a pouch of herbs, and the heavy knowledge that he can't really save anyone. It's tragic, it's ridiculous, and somehow it's still kind of heroic. You head back to your little wooden box of a room, curl up under your itchy blanket, and shut your eyes. Outside, you hear the bells again. Not for mass, not for celebration. These bells are for the dead. The sound lingers as you drift off, and somewhere in your dreams you swear you hear footsteps. Slow, steady, and echoing, with the quiet panic of a plague doctor making his final rounds. You don't wake to bells this time. You wake to perfume, or at least something that thinks it's perfume. The air is thick with a sickly sweet scent. Roses, lavender, maybe cloves, and definitely something dead hiding underneath it all. Like a flower shop run out of a crypt, it seeps under your door and clings to your clothes like it's trying to baptize you in eau de denial. When you finally stumble outside, blinking against the morning haze, you see where it's coming from. Everyone is doused in something. A woman walks by fanning herself with a posy of herbs tied with a ribbon. A merchant has little pouches of dried flowers sewn into his cloak like he's a walking sachet. And that man by the bakery? He's literally waving a smoking censer of incense as he walks, like a one-man parade of misplaced confidence. It's not just fashion, it's fear, because today's story is all about perfume as protection, and how, in a time when science had no answers, people turned to their noses for salvation. Here's your historical fact to start the day. During the Black Plague, people believed that pleasant smells could ward off disease. According to the dominant theory of the time, miasma theory, illness was spread by bad air. Rot, decay, foul odours, all signs that the plague was lurking. So it made sense in a terrible, tragic way that good smells might protect you. It wasn't about hygiene, it was about survival. You follow a pair of women into a small apothecary shop tucked beneath an arched stone doorway. Inside it's dim, cluttered, and overwhelmingly fragrant. Dried bundles of herbs hang from the ceiling like upside-down witches. Shelves groan under glass vials and wax-sealed pots. The air is dense with clove, cinnamon, and vinegar. Medieval Febreze. The apothecary, a thin man with a nose that looks like it's sniffed every spice in the known world, explains his inventory. He has pomanders, little metal balls filled with aromatic compounds, worn around the neck or hung from belts. There's rose water for splashing on linens, vinegar-soaked sponges for holding under your nose, and herbal mixtures you can burn or boil in your home to drive out the bad air. He holds up a jar and announces proudly, "This one includes angelica, wormwood, and a pinch of camphor. Guaranteed to keep death out." You don't ask what his refund policy is. Outside, you see people taking this olfactory strategy into their own hands. A butcher has hung bundles of thyme around his stall like garlic for vampires. A priest walks by with a nosegay shoved directly under his nose. Children wear little cloth bags around their necks stuffed with rosemary and dried orange peel. A man sneezes and immediately starts sniffing a sponge soaked in vinegar like it's a medieval Vicks inhaler. Here's your quirky fact of the night. People used to coat the insides of their masks or sleeves with strong-smelling substances so they could breathe clean. In fact, that's why plague doctors wore those long beaks, to fill the space in front of their nose with herbs and prevent breathing in tainted air. If you didn't have a mask, your sleeve would do. People walked around with one arm permanently glued to their face like a dramatic soap opera character. Now, for the scholars. The debate here is more philosophical than factual. Some historians argue that the obsession with good smells reveals how desperate people were to control something, anything, in a world unravelling around them. Others suggest that it wasn't completely unfounded. After all, bad smells often did indicate decay, contamination, or filth. Avoiding them might not stop the plague, but it did help people steer clear of dangerous environments, even if they didn't understand the real cause. You pause near a house where someone is boiling vinegar and herbs in a big pot. The windows are open, trying to draw the scented steam through every room. Inside, a child coughs, and a woman fans her with a dried lavender bundle. A man in the corner mutters prayers over a wooden cross while clutching a sachet of myrrh. They're doing everything they know how to do. That's the thing, none of this works. Not really. The plague isn't scared of cinnamon or crushed petals, but when everything around you is crumbling, when your neighbours are dying, the air smells like rot, and the doctors wear bird masks, you do what you can. You light a candle, you stuff your sleeves with mint. You pretend that maybe, just maybe, your perfume is stronger than death. You stop to rest near the church steps, where a group of nuns are preparing what looks like a public fumigation. They're burning herbs in large clay bowls, waving the smoke around with fans made of feathers and old parchment. One nun chants while another tosses more sage into the flames. You get the sense they don't expect miracles. They just don't know what else to do. A man walks by wearing a wreath of flowers around his hat. He's cheerful in a way that feels slightly unhinged. You ask him what it's for. He grins. If I'm going to die, I'd rather smell like a spring morning than a rotting corpse. Fair enough. You let him pass without further questions. As the sun dips low and shadows stretch across the plague-worn streets, you notice how tired everyone looks. Not just physically, but spiritually. The perfume, the potions, the perfumed pomanders, it's all an effort to push back the dark, to create a bubble of safety in a world gone rancid. You head back to your room and find someone's hung a sprig of rue over your door. A kind gesture, meant to protect against evil. You leave it there. Maybe it doesn't work. Maybe none of it works. But it smells nice. You curl up in your straw bed, surrounded by the faint scent of herbs, vinegar, and wax. Outside, someone's burning sweetwood, and for once the air doesn't reek of dread. Just something warm, earthy, and faintly floral. You let it fill your lungs, close your eyes, and imagine a world where smell ill actually meant safety. This morning you wake to silence, which in this world is never a good sign. No carts creaking by, no merchants shouting, no pigs squealing in protest over breakfast, just the soft rustle of wind between buildings and the occasional creak of wood settling under the weight of too many years. When you step outside, the streets are mostly empty, and the smell hits you even harder than usual. Thick, putrid, unmistakable. Death is in the air. You already know what's coming. The signs have been building, marked doors, blackened windows, that sudden stillness that hangs over certain streets, but nothing prepares you for the carts. You hear the first one before you see it, a low, rhythmic squeaking of wheels straining under too much weight. Then it rounds the corner, pulled by a gaunt horse and guided by a man with a scarf tied over his mouth, as if that'll keep the horror out. He's collecting bodies. Welcome to what might be the grimmest part of your medieval stay. Death carts and corpse pits. No more pretending, no more posies or vinegar masks. This is what happens when there are simply too many dead and not enough places to put them. Your historical fact tonight: mass burial pits became a necessity during the Black Death. In towns and cities overwhelmed by the sheer volume of corpses, which there was no time or space for traditional funerals. Graveyards filled up, churchyards overflowed. Eventually people dug deep communal trenches, sometimes entire fields were converted into pits for plague victims. Whole families were tossed in together, often wrapped in whatever they died in. No markers, no prayers, just layers of bodies and earth. You follow the cart at a safe distance. It stops in front of a narrow house with a rag tied to the door handle. The driver knocks once, no answer. He opens the door and steps in, emerging a moment later with a child in his arms, then an older man, and finally a woman slumped over like she's just sleeping. He moves slowly, not out of respect, but because the weight of the dead is heavy and constant. You see the exhaustion in his face. This is his job. Every day. Load the cart, dump the bodies, do it again tomorrow. Your stomach turns. And not just from the smell, it's the casualness. The way people watch from behind shutters or cracks in the door, and then look away like it's just another delivery. It is, in a way. The only thing that changes is who's in the cart next. You walk on and find the edge of town where today's pit is being dug. A group of labourers, grave diggers. Though that term feels inadequate, hack at the earth with shovels and pickaxes. The hole is already deep enough to swallow a house, and yet still not deep enough for what they expect to come by nightfall. You can smell the rot from here. The wind shifts and brings it right to you, meaty, sour and hauntingly human. Here's your quirky fact, one that feels both absurd and horribly believable. Some pits were so full that people had to walk across wooden planks laid over the corpses to reach deeper spots. Just imagine that for a second. Someone's brother, mother, child, stepped over by a man trying to make room for tomorrow's dead. The grim efficiency of it all. A silent, brutal math. And here's the debate. Were these pits truly as horrific as the records say? Some scholars argue that the most nightmarish accounts come from later chroniclers, people writing with an agenda or trying to make the past sound more dramatic than it was. Others say no, the horror was real and probably understated. After all, many of the first-hand accounts were written by clergy and officials who actually witnessed the devastation. Eyewitnesses don't tend to exaggerate when they're shoveling dirt onto neighbours. You walk along the edge of the trench and spot a priest muttering a quick blessing, as another body is lowered in. His voice is hoarse, his eyes hollow. There's no ceremony, no eulogy, just a few Latin words and a fast sign of the cross. The pit is already dotted with flies, and the buzz is constant, a low, angry hum that sticks to your skin when one shouts, and the cart returns with another load. The driver gestures toward the growing pile. The labourers glance at the sun still low in the sky. It's going to be a long day. You step back and watch from a distance. A woman nearby cries quietly, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She doesn't wait for the pit to be ready. She kisses the bundle once, sets it on the ground, and walks away without looking back. You wander toward the river, needing distance, needing something that doesn't smell like loss. But even the water seems still, like it's mourning too. You sit on a stone wall and try to process the sheer scale of it. The normalization of mass death. The way the living just keep going because they have to. And here's what gets you. The dead don't scare anyone anymore. The dying, yes. The sick, absolutely. But the dead? They're just logistics. As the sky dims and the air cools, the carts keep moving. You hear one rattle by as you close your eyes, its wheels creaking under the weight of the day. Somewhere nearby, a dog howls. Maybe it's morning, or maybe it just wants food. The line between the two is blurry these days. You lie awake longer than usual, the images stuck in your head, the open pit, the casual shovel. Toss. The little bundle with no name. There's no peace in this part of history. No tidy ending. Just the question that hangs in the air like the smell. Who's next? And yet even in all of this, people endure. They cook, they sing, they hope, because they have to. Because death might fill the streets, but life still flickers in doorways and kitchen hearths and whispered prayers over lavender bundles. You pull your blanket tighter, nose full of ash and herbs and the sour weight of the day. Sleep comes slowly, but eventually, even grief gets tired. The morning air is heavy, like the town has been holding its breath all night and hasn't quite exhaled yet. You step outside and everything seems a little dimmer, a little slower, like the colour's been drained from the walls. You don't hear children playing, there's no clatter of hooves, no cheerful shouting from the bread seller, with a questionable sense of hygiene. The only sound is the low rumble of carts and the occasional clang of a bell in the distance. Today, more than any other, it hits you. The entire town smells like fear. Not just the usual bouquet of rot smoke and what died in the well, but something else. Something sour, sharp and alive. Anxiety has a scent here. It mixes with sweat and vinegar, clings to clothes, lingers in doorways. You can practically taste it in the air. No one makes eye contact anymore. People walk fast, keep their heads down, clutching their little pouches of herbs like lifelines. You wander into the market square, which looks less like a centre of commerce and more like the ghost of one. Most stalls are shuttered. A few desperate vendors sit behind piles of goods no one wants to touch. One woman sells dried fish that smells like it retired from being edible sometime last year. Another pushes garlic, whispering that it keeps the plague away. She says this while scratching her armpit with the same hand she just used to touch raw onions. You politely take 2 steps back. Here's your historical fact. People in plague-era Europe really did believe that fear and emotion itself could make you sick. Emotional instability was thought to weaken the body, open you up to bad humours or miasma. so people tried to stay calm, even if the sky was falling and their neighbour just dropped dead in front of them. Doctors recommended it. Priests preached it. Panic, they believed, was contagious and dangerous. But the irony, of course, is that everyone was panicking, just very, very quietly. You pass a man furiously scrubbing his front step with wine, muttering to himself between scrapes. Another sits against a wall, rocking back and forth while whispering prayers into his sleeve. A third woman stares at the sky, tears running silently down her face as she clutches a child who won't stop coughing. Everyone's pretending they're fine. No one is fine. Here's a curious little fringe fact. Some believe that even foul smells could be absorbed by overly emotional people. Like if you were too afraid, the bad air would enter your body more easily through your pores, carried in on your fear. So people tried to stay calm for practical reasons, not just spiritual ones. Panic made you vulnerable. Grief made you weak. Hysteria was practically a death sentence. You stop near a church where a group of people are lighting candles, not for a service, those have mostly stopped, but just to do something. The priest, hollow-eyed and red-nosed, waves a censer filled with thick, choking incense. It smells like pine and desperation. A woman keels over mid-prayer, overcome not by disease but by grief. No one rushes to help her. They step back, giving her space, not out of respect, but out of fear. Let's talk about the debate historians love to argue over. Did people actually live in this constant suffocating dread, or are we just projecting modern fears backward? Some researchers argue that life during the Black Death wasn't one long panic attack, that many people just carried on, adapted, accepted death as a part of life. Others say that's romanticising the past. Letters and records from the time show a society that was deeply traumatised and was psychologically battered and spiritually wrecked. Entire villages disappeared. Families were torn apart. The social fabric didn't just fray, it dissolved. And the fear, it seeped into everything. You walk past a house with red paint smeared across the door. Not a symbol of illness this time, but of superstition. Red, some believed, could repel the plague. Bright colours might confuse the spirits. One man even painted his entire shop with crushed berries. It looked like a crime scene, but he swore it kept customers safe. You didn't see any customers. A boy runs past you with a bundle of herbs tied to a stick, swinging it through the air like a sword. He laughs, just once, before his mother yanks him inside by the collar. "You'll bring it home," she hisses. You can't tell if she's talking about dirt or death. You pause to rest by a small well, where a few people have gathered. They speak in hushed voices about who's fallen sick, who hasn't been seen, who's fled the city. Rumours pass between them like coins. A miracle healer in the next town, a priest who raised a boy from the brink, a woman who drinks vinegar every morning and hasn't even sneezed once. All of it sounds ridiculous, but you understand why they cling to it, because what else is there? The silence breaks mid-afternoon when a cart rolls by. Not for our bodies this time, but supplies. The driver rings a bell, not for death, but for goods. People emerge from their homes like cautious mice, approaching the cart in a nervous wave. They barter in whispers, hands wrapped in cloth, sleeves pulled over mouths. No one touches directly, coins are tossed. Goods are left in baskets and collected later. No one lingers. Back in your room you find that someone has left a bundle of sage under your pillow. A quiet gesture. Maybe a silly blessing. Maybe just their way of saying stay alive. You don't question it. You leave it there. That night the air is thicker than usual. You lie awake listening to your own heartbeat and the distant creak of footsteps on wood. The world feels stretched, like it's holding too much at once. Grief, fear, exhaustion. Your nose burns with the lingering perfume of herbs. You taste ash every time you breathe, and still, people are trying. They boil water. They light candles. They say prayers, tell stories, rub oils into their skin, hang rosemary from their ceilings, and whisper that everything will be fine. Maybe it won't, but maybe saying it helps. So you close your eyes, pull the blanket tight, and let the fear settle beside you like an old friend. After all, it's not going anywhere. The bells start before dawn today. Slow, uneven tolls that echo through the mist like a warning, whispered too late. You groan, drag yourself out of your straw bed, and already know what kind of day this is going to be. The kind where even the rats look exhausted. You step out into the street, and for the first time in days, the movement coming from the town's monastery. A steady stream of robed figures, heads bowed, hands tucked into their sleeves filing out in eerie silence. And just like that, you've stumbled into the weird, complicated world of religious hygiene. Which is actually way more interesting than it sounds, because depending on the religious order, being a monk in the 14th century meant you were either obsessively clean or entirely unbothered by your own body odour. There was no in-between. You follow the procession up toward the monastery, ducking behind a crumbling wall just in time to avoid eye contact with a particularly stern-looking nun. From here, you get a good look at the monastery's washhouse. It's simple, just a stone basin fed by a thin stream of water, but it's running. And in this time and place, that's a miracle. A pair of younger monks are already elbow-deep in the basin, splashing their faces with icy water while whispering morning prayers. Here's your historical fact of the day. Many monastic orders in medieval Europe had strict rules about cleanliness. Daily or weekly bathing, regular hand and foot washing, and even full-body immersion for some rituals. Not because they were worried about germs, they weren't, but because cleanliness was seen as a spiritual discipline. A clean body, in theory, helped foster a clean soul. Inside the cloister, you see more of this in action. A monk carefully scrubs the floor with a rag dipped in lavender water. Another trims the wicks of beeswax candles while humming a hymn. There's a calm here, an orderliness that feels completely alien compared to the chaotic, plague-ridden streets just beyond the gates. But not all religious folk believed in washing up. This is where things get weird, and here comes your quirky fact. Some hermits and extreme ascetics believed that avoiding bathing was a sign of holiness. The dirtier and smellier they got, the more they were rejecting worldly vanity. A monk who reeked like a turnip left in the sun was admired for his devotion. There were even saints who proudly claimed to have never bathed after childhood, as if that made them closer to God. Some wore hair shirts, literally shirts made of coarse animal hair, as a form of suffering, and guess what, they didn't wash those either. So while one group of monks is out here scrubbing floors and washing their feet in lavender, another might be hiding in a cave covered in lice praying away the temptation of soap. Inside the monastery's kitchen, you see a more practical side of hygiene. The cook, an elderly monk with eyebrows like tiny sheep, rinses vegetables in a stone sink. His hands are clean, well, cleaner than average, and he even dries them with a cloth. You spot a bowl of herbal rinse on the side, probably made from sage and vinegar. It's used for wiping down surfaces. They are trying, in their own monastic way, to keep disease out. Whether it works is another matter entirely. Now let's pivot to our open scholarly debate. Did monasteries and religious institutions actually fare better during the plague because of their emphasis on cleanliness? Some historians think so. Records show that certain cloisters had lower death rates, possibly because they practiced rudimentary sanitation, cleaner water, isolated living, structured routines. Others argue the opposite, that monasteries, with their communal living and constant contact with the sick, because monks often served as caregivers, became hotbeds for infection. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. If you were lucky enough to be in a well-maintained monastery with good practices and strong walls, you might survive longer than the average street dweller. If not, you were just as doomed as everyone else. Back outside, a group of monks tends a herb garden with the quiet urgency of people who believe the next tincture might actually make a difference. You hear them naming the plants in Latin: rosemary, yarrow, hyssop. They crush leaves between their fingers and inhale deeply, eyes closing in prayer, or maybe just exhaustion. You notice that their habits, their robes, are surprisingly clean, laundered, and hanging dry on a line nearby. One monk even holds a bar of soap. It's rough grey and smells faintly of lye and ash, but it exists. Actual soap. You blink. Miracles do happen. As you wander through the monastery's grounds, you come across the infirmary. It's quiet. A single monk sits beside a bed, reading scripture to a patient whose face is blotchy and still. The monk wears a cloth over his nose, a sprig of mint tucked inside. It won't help, but it's something. He notices you and nods, just a little. A silent acknowledgement that you've seen too much, that no amount of lavender water can scrub away the sadness of this place. You stay for a moment longer, watching as another monk lights incense and waves it slowly through the room, hoping the smoke will carry the sickness away. It won't, but it smells good. Comforting, holy, maybe that's enough. As you make your way back into the world beyond the monastery walls, you feel the shift immediately. The calm falls away. The scent of rosemary is replaced by rot. The quiet is filled with the coughs and cries of the street. But now you carry with you a strange sense of peace. Not hope exactly, but something like it. You pass a woman at a well, washing her hands with rainwater collected in a cracked jug. She doesn't look at you, but she hums a tune that sounds like the one the monks were singing earlier. Maybe she heard it once. Maybe she's trying to feel clean, even if she's not. Back in your little room, you find a thin bar of soap sitting on your windowsill. Someone must have left it. From the monastery, maybe. It smells like lye and herbs and a possibility. You hold it in your hands for a long time before setting it down beside your bed. And that night you sleep a little cleaner. You wake to shouting in the distance, loud, sharp voices bouncing off the narrow stone alleyways. Not the usual morning clamour about stale bread or whose goat escaped this time. This shouting has an edge to it. Tension. Urgency. You slip on your tunic, now approaching the texture of a dried sponge, and follow the noise toward the city gates, where a crowd has gathered around something, or more accurately, someone, arriving by boat. A cart stands just inside the gate, packed with barrels, crates, and a few travel-worn passengers who look like they haven't bathed in several plagues. A man climbs down, swaying slightly as he lifts a jug of wine from the cargo and yells something that sounds very much like "We're clean," which in 1348 is a bold and dangerous claim. You've just stumbled into the early, clumsy and sort of revolutionary practice of quarantine. Tonight, we're diving into how medieval cities, against all odds and with zero understanding of germ theory, invented the basic blueprint for disease isolation. And it started with places like Venice, which looked at incoming ships from plague-stricken ports and said, "Hey, maybe don't come in yet." Your historical fact of the evening is a good one. The term quarantine comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. In the mid-14th century, ships arriving in Venetian ports from infected areas were required to anchor offshore for 40 days before docking. This wasn't based on science. It was a weird mix of biblical numerology, observation and panic, but it sort of worked. If everyone on board died during those 40 days, well, problem solved. If they didn't, they were probably fine. You hang around the gates long enough to watch the argument unfold. A city official in a fine fur-lined robe, too hot for this weather, by the way, is yelling at the merchant captain, demanding to know where he's come from and whether anyone on board has coughed, bled, or grown any suspicious boils. The captain swears his ship is healthy. He's even got a letter sealed with wax, which he waves like a badge of honour. But the guards aren't buying it, and here's where things get interesting. Quarantine didn't just apply to ships. Entire households, neighbourhoods, or even towns could be locked down if plague was suspected. Doors were nailed shut, streets were barricaded, food was delivered, sometimes by brave souls or opportunistic vendors with long sticks. You didn't leave until someone said you could, or until you didn't leave for other reasons. Your quirky fact of the night. Some towns created plague houses or isolation huts outside the city walls, where the sick, and often their entire families, were sent to wait things out. These weren't hospitals, they were more like temporary exile. Some people recovered, many didn't. Either way, the town kept its distance. Back near the gate, a group of porters has gathered, hoping for work unloading cargo, but no one's allowed to touch the crates yet. Instead, a man in a ragged leather hood, possibly a city health official, possibly just someone who found a stick and made himself important, starts inspecting the barrels one by one. He pokes at them, sniffs them, taps them like he's trying to summon a spirit. Eventually, he declares one of them untrustworthy, and it's rolled away for burning. No one argues. Inside the city, the concept of quarantine is spreading like, well, the plague. You pass a house with red paint smeared across the doorframe. Again, but this time it's not just symbolic. A guard sits outside on a stool keeping watch, chewing something that looks suspiciously like a twig soaked in vinegar. The family inside isn't allowed to leave. You hear muffled voices from within, a child crying, someone pacing. They might not even be sick, but someone coughed at the wrong time, and now the door won't open for days. You make your way to the town square and find a notice posted on a board. It's a list of trusted streets, places deemed safe to walk, trade or worship. The rest are under restricted access. There's no science behind this. Just fear and rumour. But it creates a strange map of who gets to pretend things are fine and who doesn't. Now let's talk about the scholarly debate. Historians have gone back and forth over whether these early quarantines were effective or just performative. Some argue that the isolation of ships and plague houses actually did reduce transmission, especially when combined with city walls, limited travel, and outright fear. Others say it was too inconsistent to matter, enforced unevenly, abandoned when inconvenient, and riddled with loopholes for anyone with enough gold or political connections. In many cities, the poor got locked down, the rich got out. You stop at a tavern where a few men are arguing over whether they should leave town. One says he has a cousin in a village that hasn't seen a single case. Another insists it's better to stay. Travel spreads the sickness. They both reek of wine and worry. The tavern keeper interrupts to say that from now on, he's only serving customers who've stayed inside the city walls for a full fortnight. It's his version of a safety policy. He looks proud. You notice his hands are black with soot and something stickier. You order nothing. At the edge of town, you find a camp of travellers who weren't allowed in. They've set up tents and fires and are living off whatever they can scavenge or barter from passing merchants. You talk to a woman who's been there for 18 days. Her husband's sick. She doesn't think he'll make it, but she's not angry. At least we're not bringing it in, she says, with a hollow kind of pride. Better us out here than them in there. The sun begins to dip, casting long shadows across the stone walls and wooden gates. The man from the boat is still arguing with the guards, but now he's hoarse and slumped. You see his shoulders sag. He knows he's not getting in tonight. Maybe not ever. As you head back to your little hovel of questionable ventilation, you pass another house being boarded up. The carpenter hammers nails into the doorframe while the woman inside begs to be let out. Her voice cracks. No one listens. The sound of the hammer is louder. That night you lie awake thinking about what it means to be isolated, not just physically, but socially. To be marked as unsafe, unclean, maybe even cursed, and how sometimes staying put is the most anyone can do, not because it's comfortable, but because it's necessary. Quarantine didn't save everyone, but it tried. In a world of bloodletting, onions and leeches, it was one of the few responses that actually accidentally made sense. And for a brief moment as sleep creeps in, you feel grateful for modern science, for borders and testing and vaccines and everything that separates you from this world of guesswork and barricades. You close your eyes and dream of wide open places where no one's locked inside, and no one has to shout just to be heard through the wall. By now, you've learned not to trust quiet streets. If the birds are singing and the breeze actually smells like something natural, chances are you're about to step into something awful, literally or metaphorically, or both. This morning, the sun peeks over the rooftops with a suspicious level of cheer, and the air is almost pleasant. It smells of damp stone, cracked bread crusts, and is that cinnamon? You should know better than to feel hopeful, you really should. Because today you're learning the truth about the rats. You've seen them every day, of course, darting between barrels, scurrying under carts, lounging like tiny goblins in the shadows. Sometimes they look at you with what you swear is contempt, sometimes they squeak in triumph as they slip through a crack in a wall like it's their private door to Narnia. You'd probably written them off as just another medieval nuisance, like pickpockets or songs about turnips, but the reality is far darker. Because these rats, they're not just part of the scenery, they're part of the story. Here's your historical fact for the day, and it's one you may already know. The Black Death was spread not directly by rats, but by fleas that lived on them. Specifically the oriental rat flea, Xenopsilla chiopis, a truly nasty little hitchhiker. When the flea bit an infected rat, it ingested the bacteria Yersinia pestis. When the rat died, the flea jumped ship and found a new host, humans included. So yes, the rats carried the fleas carried the plague, and humans, bless them, just happened to be in the wrong place with all the wrong grooming habits. You spot one now, sitting on a step like it owns the town, licking its paws and twitching its ears with dramatic flair. It is disturbingly cute. If you didn't know better, you'd probably toss it a crumb. Instead, you give it a very wide berth. It ignores you. Now for your quirky fact. Rats weren't the original scapegoats. In fact, during the 14th century, no one really blamed them at all. Most people didn't even notice the rats, or if they did, they saw them as just another part of city life. They blamed bad air, celestial alignments, sin, foreigners, witches and divine punishment, but not the rodents. The idea that rats played a role didn't really gain traction until centuries later, when germ theory and microscopes gave us the receipts. You follow a pack of rats, yes, a pack because they move like a squad, into a grain storehouse. Inside, it's chaos. Half the sacks are gnawed open, wheat scattered across the floor, tiny paw prints in every direction. The merchant is losing his mind, cursing the animals and swinging a broom with the hopeless rage of a man at war with the wind. You ask if he's worried about plague. He scoffs. From them, he says, gesturing to the rats like they're rude cousins. They're just hungry. Same as us. You glance at the floor where fleas are almost certainly hopping around like tiny vampires. You choose not to respond. Later, you pass a street preacher yelling about the wrath of God. He waves a scroll in one hand and a cross in the other, blaming the plague on moral decay, laziness, and, for reasons unclear, overly short tunics. No mention of rats, no mention of fleas, just fire and brimstone and a crowd nodding along because it's easier to hate sin than to solve a mystery too small to see. Which brings us to the scholarly debate. Even now, historians argue over how much blame the rats really deserve. Yes, the flea theory is widely accepted, but some researchers suggest the rapid spread of the Black Death can't be explained by fleas and rats alone. They point to the possibility of airborne transmission or human-to-human spread via ectoparasites like lice and human fleas. Some even suggest that different strains of plague were at play, one that spread slower via fleas and another more aggressive strain that spread like wildfire. So the rats may be guilty, but they weren't acting alone. It's a whole criminal conspiracy of biology. You sit near a well as the sun climbs higher. A rat pokes its head out of a drainage ditch, sniffs the air and disappears. You count 5 others in the span of 10 minutes, each darting across the street like it's their personal catwalk. No one reacts. A child tosses one a crust of bread. A baker's apprentice shoos one away with a half-hearted kick. It's not that people don't see the rats, it's that they've made peace with them. Like a toxic roommate who's been around so long, you stop questioning their existence. In wealthier districts, you notice slightly fewer rats, or maybe just rats that are better at hiding. Some homes burn dried rosemary at the thresholds to purify the air. A few have hired boys to chase rodents out with sticks, but it's mostly for show. The rats always come back. They know the town better than anyone. They move through walls, under doors, along rafters. They are the original locals. You make your way toward the riverbank where refuse piles are high and buzzing with flies. And rats. Lots of rats. A man nearby offers to sell you a rat trap made of a bent spoon and some string. You decline. He tells you rats can smell fear. You don't think that's true. But the timing of the 3 rats that scurry out behind you suggests they have at least mastered dramatic entrances. By sunset, you're back in your room, watching one bold rat walk across your windowsill like it's inspecting the place. You lock eyes with it for a moment. It stares at you like you're the intruder. You wonder if it knows, if any part of its tiny rodent brain is aware of the chaos it's unleashed. Probably not, but it doesn't matter, because here, now, in the middle of a world unravelling, the rats are thriving. They feast while the people bury their dead. They scurry through palaces and plague pits alike. They are in every way winning. You lie back on your scratchy blanket, listening to the soft sound of claws against wood. You try not to think about fleas. You try not to think about what's crawling just out of sight. And when sleep finally comes, it's uneasy, riddled with dreams of whiskers, twitching tails, and tiny legs skittering over your skin. Don't worry. Tomorrow, it somehow gets worse. You're woken up not by bells or shouting or even the usual insult exchange between chickens and pigs, but by singing. Loud, echoing and off-key singing. Male voices deep and droning somewhere between a chant and a dirge, and growing steadily louder as they move through the streets. You crack open your door and peer out, only to immediately regret it. They're shirtless, they're bleeding, and they're definitely whipping themselves. Welcome to one of the more unsettling chapters of the Black Plague, the arrival of the Flagellants, a roving band of self-punishing pilgrims who believed the only way to cleanse the world of plague was to beat the sin out of themselves, publicly, loudly. With leather whips covered in metal spikes, you shuffle back into the shadows as the procession marches down the street. Dozens of men, some barefoot, some in ragged trousers, march, 2 by 2, their backs already streaked with blood. With every step they chant in Latin, swinging their whips over their shoulders, slashing their flesh in a rhythmic frenzy that is both horrifying and somehow hypnotic. Here's your historical fact for the night. The flagellant movement peaked during the height of the Black Death in the mid-14th century. These groups emerged mostly in Central Europe and spread like wildfire, fueled by the belief that the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins. And since no one could really agree whose sins were the worst, these men took it upon themselves to offer repentance on behalf of everyone, through blood, pain, and a healthy dose of public theatre. They stop in the centre of town. A large crowd gathers, because let's face it, there's not much else to do. A man in the front of the group steps forward and begins preaching. You catch bits and pieces, something about corruption, divine wrath, the poisoned sky, and the absolute necessity of suffering. Then he takes off his shirt and joins the others. The whips rise, the crowd watches, a few cry, a few cheer. One woman crosses herself and mutters something about the end times. And here's your quirky fact. Some flagellant groups even choreographed their rituals. They marched with precision, sang specific hymns, and whipped in unison like a very disturbing musical. It was performance meets penance, a medieval flash mob of self-inflicted punishment. They believed that 33.5 days of this, 1 day for each year of Christ's life, plus a half day for good measure, could purge the world of sin, and by extension the plague. You keep watching, partly out of morbid curiosity and partly because you can't look away. One man collapses, his back flayed open, blood staining the cobblestones. He's dragged aside gently, handed a piece of stale bread and a swig of vinegar, then nods and rejoins the line. You wonder if any of them ever stop, or if this is just their life now, moving from town to town, bleeding across Europe like human incense burners. Eventually the group packs up and marches on, leaving behind a street full of stunned silence and vaguely confused pigs. The crowd disperses slowly, murmuring about what they've just seen. One man swears he felt the sin leave his body just from watching. Another says the blood alone should scare the devil back into the abyss. You sit on a nearby bench and try to process what just happened. And here comes the scholarly debate. Historians still argue over how much influence the flagellants really had. Were they a fringe group, tolerated briefly and then suppressed by the church? Or were they a genuine social force, giving people an outlet for fear, grief, and guilt? It's clear that they terrified some officials and inspired others. In some towns, they were welcomed as heroes. In others, they were banned, arrested, or worse. Either way, their message spread faster than the plague itself. The world is broken, and we must bleed to fix it. You walk the streets that afternoon and notice something odd. People seem calmer. Maybe it's the shock of the flagellants. Maybe it's the unspoken relief of having seen someone else suffer in your place. A merchant quietly scrubs the blood off his doorstep. A boy mimics the whipping motion with a stick, not understanding what it meant. A woman kneels in the middle of the street, clutching a rosary so tightly her knuckles have gone white. At the edge of town, you find a makeshift camp where a few of the flagellants have stopped to rest. You stay out of sight, but you can hear them talking. Their backs are raw and bruised. One man is feverish, shaking. Another is sewing new spikes onto his whip, humming softly. They speak of cities they've visited, towns that turned them away, and one village that offered them wine and herbs in thanks. They speak of redemption like it's a physical object that they can hold if they just bleed enough. That night you sit in your bed with the sound of chanting still ringing in your ears. You think about how far people will go for a sense of control. How, when medicine fails and prayers feel unanswered, they turn to pain. Pain is tangible. It's something they can measure, something they can do. But it doesn't stop the plague. It doesn't bring anyone back. It just leaves more blood on the road. You lie down and try to sleep, but your dreams are filled with red-soaked robes, chanting voices, and the sound of whips cracking against flesh, over and over in rhythm, like a heartbeat. You wake up to the sound of a window slamming shut, then another and another, one after the next like dominoes. A door creaks. Someone hisses, "Close it!" from across the alley. The wind has changed direction, and suddenly the whole town seems to be sealing itself up like a rotting box of old cheese. You take one cautious sniff of the air and almost choke. It's thick, it's hot, and it smells like roasted sewage with a side of wet burlap and regret. You've smelled bad air before, you've walked through plague-soaked neighbourhoods and stood next to open corpse pits. But this is different. People are running, not from something they can see, but from the invisible weight hanging in the air. Today's tale is all about miasma, the medieval theory that bad smells carried death. And if you're standing in this town square right now, you can understand why people believed it. Here's your historical fact. For most of the medieval period, and well beyond, People believed that diseases like the plague were spread through miasma, or corrupted air. Not germs, not contact, just foul odours rising from rot, filth and decay, poisoning the air itself and in turn your lungs, your blood and your soul. Doctors warned about it. Priests preached about it. Even common folk could sense the danger. If it smelled bad, it probably was bad. And since everything around you smells like a compost heap on fire, the logic checks out. You wander into the main market square and find a group of townspeople lighting bundles of herbs and waving them in the air. Lavender, sage, juniper. It's like a desperate potpourri party. Smoke drifts in every direction, and people stand in it, breathing deep like they're at a medieval spa. Someone walks by with a pine branch tied to their face like a makeshift mask. It looks ridiculous. It also smells better than anything else you've experienced in days. Then comes the vinegar brigade. A group of men with soaked rags walk around pressing their cloths to doors, windows, even the mouths of sick children. The idea is to neutralise the foul air before it enters the home. Does it work? Of course not. But it's one of the few defences people believe they have. Here's your quirky fact. Some medieval physicians carried canes with hollow handles filled with herbs so they could sniff pleasant aromas instead of the stench of death. Think of it as an early version of aromatherapy meets denial. One Dr. Sir, you're told, even carried a hollowed-out orange stuffed with cloves and rosemary, tied to his belt like a fancy citrus grenade. When things got too gross, he just inhaled it like a calming drug. You make your way through the street, watching people burn things, old clothes, herbs, animal dung, anything that creates smoke. Why? Because they believe that cleansing the air means pushing out the bad with something else. In some neighbourhoods, they even hire people to walk around beating drums or clanging pots, believing the vibrations would shake the sickness loose. You hear that now in the distance, a rhythmic clang, clang, clang like some absurd parade of hope and noise. You pass by a house where a man stands with his family, all holding branches of wormwood in front of their faces. "Don't breathe without it," he whispers to his child. "The air is heavy today." The child nods, obedient and pale, clutching the leaves like a talisman. The mother stares at the sky as if expecting the plague to come rolling in like a storm cloud. Here's where things get debated. Modern historians still discuss how influential the miasma theory was in shaping public health practices. On the one hand, it was wrong, germs cause disease, not smells. On the other hand, miasma theory accidentally led to practices that helped stop the spread of illness, cleaning streets, improving ventilation, and encouraging separation from rot and filth. In a weird, ironic twist, being afraid of bad air sometimes meant avoiding the actual sources of infection. You arrive at the edge of the city where a trench has been dug, not for bodies this time, but for refuse. A man with a bent back and hands like cracked leather is shoveling what looks like a combination of ashes, rotting fruit, and old leather shoes into the pit. He sprinkles lime powder over the top, muttering that it seals in the sickness. His assistant pours a jar of pungent vinegar over the pile. It hisses. So does your nose. The smell from this pit is legendary. Your eyes water instantly, your throat clenches. You try to back away, but a wind gust catches you off guard and slaps you in the face with the full bouquet. For a moment, you actually believe the miasma theory. You believe it in your bones. You believe it with your entire respiratory system. If death had a cologne, this would be it. Later, you find yourself in a church where even the sacred space has been overcome with the smell of human bodies, tallow candles, and burnt incense. The priest burns herbs in front of the altar, waving a thurible like he's trying to create a smokescreen. You can't see the altar through the haze, you can't see much of anything, but it smells less awful in here, which is something. The priest tells you the air is thicker when sin is nearby, that the weight you feel in your chest is not just fear, it's corruption. He hands you a cloth dabbed with something that smells vaguely like rosemary and wet leather. You press it to your face and pretend it helps. Outside, the sun begins to set. The air cools slightly, but the stench remains, rising from gutters, floating from windows, exhaled in every cough and whispered prayer. People shut themselves indoors, doors slam, windows bolt, the city locks itself away again. Back in your room, you stuff the priest's rag into the crack beneath the door. It won't stop the rats, it won't stop the fleas, but maybe, just maybe, it'll keep the worst of the air out. You sit on your mattress and breathe shallowly, listening to your own heartbeat and the faint sound of something bubbling in the gutter outside. You can smell it from here. And yet, as the moon rises and the darkness deepens, a strange calm settles in. Not because the air is cleaner, not because you're safe, but because in this moment everyone is fighting the same invisible enemy. The wind, the smell, the heaviness pressing against every lung, it touches everyone. Rich or poor, holy or wicked, terrified or defiant. And so, with a sprig of rosemary under your pillow and a vinegar rag clutched in one hand, you try to sleep. You dream of cleaner skies and fresh wind, of air that carries nothing but the scent of rain. The streets are buzzing this morning, but not in the usual cheerful market way. No songs about ale or onions, no pigs chasing children through alleys. Instead, there's a thick current of whispered judgment and side-eye. You don't even need to ask what's going on, you can feel it. Today, the town is having one of its favourite medieval pastimes, deciding who stinks worse, peasants or nobles. Spoiler, it's not as obvious as you'd think. You step out into the daylight, your tunic holding on to its 7th consecutive day of wear like a badge of honour. A group of townspeople are huddled near a bakery, not for bread this time, but to gossip about a visiting noble family staying in the stone manor down the lane. They say the lord's wife hasn't bathed since Easter, someone mutters, and she sleeps in a wig full of lavender and lies. You blink. Surely she meant lice, or maybe both. Let's get right into your historical fact. In many cases, medieval nobles were less hygienic than the common folk. Surprising, right? But the rich often wore layers upon the layers of heavy, expensive fabrics. Velvet, brocade, wool, all tightly laced, impossible to wash properly, and rarely changed. And when you believe bathing opens your pores to death, see section 3, still sorry about that, those layers became a kind of barrier between your skin and the miasma. A very musty, sweaty, perfume-soaked barrier. In contrast, peasants, despite having little, were closer to rivers, streams, and the daily labour that required rinsing off now and then. They often wore simple linen garments, which were easier to wash and dry. Were they clean? Absolutely not by modern standards, but did they smell slightly less like a mobile greenhouse of rotting orchids and fear? Honestly, sometimes yes. You wander toward the manor house to investigate. The noble courtyard is quiet. Too quiet. The servants are discreetly scrubbing something out of the cobblestones, and it smells like someone spilled perfume wine and something rottener. You peer inside a side window and spot a nobleman reclining in a fur-lined robe, surrounded by cushions. His wig sits on a stand nearby, braided and dusted with powder. A tiny dog in a velvet vest licks something off the floor. A servant walks by with a silver bowl, not for soup but for spitting. Rich folk didn't always wipe their mouths, they spat into basins between courses. Sometimes during conversation, you decide to never eat again. And here's your quirky fact. Nobles frequently carried pomanders, fancy metal balls filled with scented herbs, on chains or belts to mask their body odour. They weren't for others, they were for themselves. If they smelled the world around them, something had gone terribly wrong. The higher their status, the more layers they wore and the more perfume they piled on to disguise the biological uprising happening underneath. Back in the town square, you spot a laundress hauling a bundle of peasant clothes toward the river. She waves off your question with a shrug. Nobles don't let us wash theirs, she says. Too delicate. Too sacred. She mimics a noble accent, clutching her bundle dramatically. This fabric must not touch the water. The embroidery might melt. You laugh. She doesn't. They'd rather stink in silk than smell clean in linen. You follow her to the riverbank, where she and several other women beat clothes on stones while discussing which homes smell the worst. That rich widow on Hen's Alley, one says. Her gown could walk on its own. Another nods solemnly. I heard she's got a comb for every day of the week. Never uses any of them. Here comes the debate. Scholars have long disagreed on whether the wealthy really were worse off in terms of hygiene, or if the smell-shaming of nobles by the lower classes was just a form of rebellion, punching up with words instead of weapons. Some argue that wealthier households had private washrooms, access to exotic soaps, and scented oils. Others point out that those same homes were sealed off, poorly ventilated, and built to impress, not to breathe. Wealth didn't automatically mean clean. Sometimes it just meant rotten things in fancier boxes. You drift back toward the town as the sun rises higher, and the scent war intensifies. A vendor hawks scented gloves dipped in rose oil, promising that wearing them will make your hands nobler. A boy runs by with a wreath of garlic and dandelions around his neck. For protection, he says, grinning through dirt-caked teeth. Meanwhile, a woman in a faded green smock is scrubbing her arms at a fountain while muttering something about keeping God's house clean. You stop for lunch, a generous term as it's just a crust of bread and a suspicious piece of cheese. You sit near a couple of labourers who argue about whether the local knight bathes. One insists he's seen the man dip his feet in a bucket of vinegar every full moon. The other laughs so hard he chokes. That's just to keep the dogs from chewing his boots, he says. Eventually you wander back into the nicer part of town, the houses with flower boxes and guards who don't smile. The noblewoman from earlier is walking with two companions, faces powdered pale, lips tinted with crushed berries. Their dresses are embroidered and, if you look closely, absolutely filthy at the hems. Mud, horse droppings, maybe worse. They walk carefully, stepping over puddles like the ground offends them. One pulls out a scented kerchief and waves it around her face like a queen fanning away the pour. You lean against a wall and watch them disappear into a house that smells like damp velvet and cloves. A servant outside pours lavender water onto the doorstep, not to clean it, just to perfume it. The smell hits you a moment later. It's nice, for 3 seconds. Then it turns, sweet rot with a floral top note. Back in your room, you sit on your straw bed, thinking about class and cleanliness, how the poor are called dirty, even when they wash, and the rich are praised for elegance, even as they ferment beneath perfume. The plague doesn't care, of course. It creeps through rags and silk alike, and yet there's comfort in watching how people respond to it, with gossip, with pride, with garlic necklaces and linen shifts washed in rivers. Everyone wants to survive. Some just want to smell fancy while doing it. As night falls, you hear someone shouting insults in the alley, something about your lordship's backside smelling like a goat's funeral. You fall asleep grinning. Even in the face of death, the people still know how to laugh. Especially at the rich. It starts, as so many questionable medieval days do, with a terrible decision about breakfast. You stumble outside half asleep, only to be offered a warm cup of something that smells like regret and hops. Not soup, not tea, beer. It's barely sunrise and the town's already drinking, again, but this time you're not judging. Because today we're talking about why medieval people drank beer and wine instead of water, and disturbingly, why they were absolutely right to do so. You glance over at the well at the edge of the square, and even from here it does not look promising. It's surrounded by moss. The bucket smells faintly of something swampy. A rat scurries across the stones, then pauses, like it wants to remind you that it probably bathed in that same water last night. You nod back at it in mutual disgust. Here's your historical fact. In many parts of plague-era Europe, water wasn't just unpleasant. It was dangerous. Rivers and wells were often contaminated by human waste, dead animals, spoiled food, and things no one wanted to admit they threw in there. With no modern sewage systems and an extremely lax attitude toward waste disposal, water sources became giant petri dishes of medieval misery. So people drank what they trusted, beer and wine, not the heavy ales or bold cabernets you might be imagining. These were mild, low-alcohol versions, sometimes barely fermented. Think of it as medieval Gatorade. A safe, everyday hydration solution that wouldn't kill you halfway through breakfast. You take a sip from the cup you've been handed. It's lukewarm, slightly fizzy, and tastes like watered-down toast with commitment issues. But it doesn't make your throat itch or your stomach tighten, so honestly, 5 stars. Children drink it. Pregnant women drink it. Monks, nuns, nobles, farmers, chimney sweeps, everyone sipping from ceramic jugs and wooden cups with the casual air of people who've never known a sober Tuesday. And you realise something funny. They don't even think of it as drinking. It's just what you do. Clean water is a gamble. Beer is breakfast. You wander toward the monastery to confirm your theory, and yep, there's Brother Matteo, waist deep in barley sacks, stirring a vat of what he calls the Lord's Pale Ale. He explains, while wiping sweat from his forehead with what may have once been a napkin, that brewing was a sacred task. Monks brewed beer not just to drink, but to sell and share, using fermentation as a form of divine filtration. Water is untrustworthy, he says solemnly. God put yeast on earth for a reason. Which brings us to your quirky fact of the day. Small beer, a weak, watery ale brewed from leftover mash, was often served in place of water at the meals, even in hospitals and schools. It contained just enough alcohol to kill off bacteria, but not enough to get anyone tipsy. You could drink it all day without falling into a ditch, usually. But not everyone drank beer. In the more wine-soaked corners of Europe, France, Italy, parts of Spain, wine was the hydration of choice, and not the kind you'd sip under candlelight. We're talking about wine that was sometimes boiled, spiced, watered down, or made from grapes that would have been rejected by any modern vineyard. Still, it was better than the alternative. Sometimes they mixed it with herbs or honey to strengthen the stomach. You try a sip of someone's mulled wine in the market square and instantly regret it. It tastes like cinnamon bark soaked in vinegar and ambition. You're just starting to think the whole beer for breakfast thing might be genius when you hear someone yelling near the town well. A boy has fallen in. Again. A small crowd gathers as they haul him out with a rope, and an impressive amount of yelling. He's soaked, shivering, and very much regretting his decision to retrieve a shoe. His mother drags him away while smacking his arm with a wooden spoon. A man mutters, he'll have to drink 3 cups of ale just to wash the water out of him. This leads neatly into our scholarly debate. Historians still argue over how bad the water really was. Some say the danger has been exaggerated, that not all medieval water was deadly, and that clean sources did exist, especially in rural areas or well-managed towns. Others point out that even clean rivers ran near cesspits and livestock, and without a working germ theory, people simply couldn't connect diarrhea to the water they were drinking. So beer and wine became the safer bet, especially during a plague outbreak, when fear of contamination skyrocketed. You stop at a tavern for lunch. It's 10 a.m, but again, time has no meaning here. The owner, a cheerful woman with arms like oak branches, pours you a mug of weak ale and plops down a bowl of something she swears used to be stew. It's unclear what's floating in it. You dunk a chunk of bread into the liquid and decide not to ask questions. Next to you, a group of labourers discuss the plague and argue about whether it's safer to drink your wine hot or cold. One insists on adding garlic. Another swears by herbs boiled in white wine as a kind of miracle tonic. Keeps the lungs open, he says, before immediately coughing into his elbow. You move slightly farther down the bench. Outside, you pass a vendor selling plague wine, bottled with a wax seal and a label that promises immunity. The ingredients? Grapes, hope, God. He winks. You keep walking. Back at your lodging, you notice a ceramic jug sitting on your windowsill, left by the innkeeper. A gift, apparently. Inside is weak ale, slightly sweet, still warm. You sip it slowly while watching the sunset burn down the edge of the sky. It tastes like the kind of thing you'd only love if you thought the water might kill you. And maybe that's the thing. You're not just drinking because it's safer. You're drinking because everyone else is. Because it calms the nerves. Because it tastes like something made with effort in a world where so much feels out of your control. Because sometimes making it to the end of the day is worth toasting. Even if the toast is made of barley and regret. You curl into your straw bed, the jug beside you still half full. Outside, the tavern glows warm with light and laughter. Inside, you feel the faintest buzz of calm, probably the yeast. Or maybe just the thought that even in a world of death, dirt and rat-whispered secrets, they figured out how to stay hydrated. Barely. Hiccup. You wake up with a headache. Not a modern screen time and dehydration headache, but a medieval one. Forged from sleeping on straw stuffed with disappointment, inhaling air thick with yeast and corpse smoke and sipping weak beer like it's a vitamin. The good news, you're not dead. The bad news, you smell like someone boiled beef fat in a fireplace and rubbed it into your armpits. You sit up and sniff your tunic, which has now achieved a texture somewhere between burlap sack and old sponge. You wonder, not for the first time, how anyone back then kept themselves remotely clean. And that's when you remember what you came here to learn today, soap. What passed for soap. Let's set the mood. You walk out into the chill of morning, down toward the part of town that always smells like boiled hair and melted bones, and no, you're not hallucinating, that's actually where the soap makers work. You've seen bad jobs in this time period. Gong farmers, plague cart drivers, corpse pit diggers. But this might be worse. Because medieval soap isn't made with gentle herbs and nourishing coconut oil, it's made with animal fat, wood ash and suffering. Your historical fact of the day: medieval soap was usually made by mixing lye, an alkaline substance from wood ash, with rendered animal fat usually from pigs or sheep. The result was a harsh, gritty soap that stripped away dirt, oils, and probably part of your will to live. It was effective in the sense that it worked, but it was also abrasive enough to double as sandpaper. Imagine washing your face with a cheese grater that smells like scorched bacon grease. You find the soap maker's shop easily. Just follow the smoke and try not to breathe through your nose. Inside, a burly woman is stirring a thick, bubbling pot of something that looks like soup and smells like regret. She smiles when she sees you. "Fresh batch," she says proudly, dipping a ladle into the pot and pouring it into a wooden mould. You ask what's in it. She says, "Fat from the butcher, ash from the bakery fire, bit of rosemary. Smells nice, eh?" It does not. Here's your quirky fact. Some soap recipes in the medieval period included things like clay, urine, or herbs. Not for luxury, but because people were experimenting. Soap was both a science and a gamble. Some batches hardened nicely and lasted for weeks. Others melted into goo or turned into a weird caustic mess that could burn your skin. Some folks swore by imported Castile soap from Spain, made with olive oil and more refined, but for most people, that was a luxury far beyond reach. You ask the soap maker how often people actually use this stuff. She shrugs. Depends. Clothes, once a month. Hair, when there's lice. Body, maybe before a wedding. She hands you a cooled lump of soap. It's rough, uneven, still a bit soft in the middle. You sniff it. Yes, it smells better than you expected. A little smoky, a little herbal. A lot like desperation. You take it with you as you head toward the river, where a few brave souls are bathing. Not leisurely soaking, mind you. This is brisk, cold, miserable washing. The kind you only do when you absolutely have to. A woman scrubs her arms with a bar of soap that looks like a chipped brick. A boy nearby uses sand and water to scrub dirt off his legs. Someone else just dunks themselves under a waterfall and screams. This brings us to the big question, and the scholarly debate. How widespread was soap use in the medieval period really? Some argue it was common enough that people did wash regularly, or at least semi-regularly, especially in towns where soap makers set up shop. Others say that while soap existed, it wasn't used nearly as often as modern minds might assume. Too expensive, too harsh, too inconvenient. People spot cleaned. They used cloths, rinses, oils, or just hoped the stink would fade on its own. Plus, the whole bathing opens your pores to death idea made regular soaping kind of a risky business. You wander back toward the town square, soap still in hand, and notice something new. A row of stalls selling fancy soap. One merchant claims his bars are infused with rose oil, another swears by goat's milk. You pick one up and realise quickly it's mostly wax and wishful thinking. A woman tries to sell you a bundle of crushed lavender tied with twine, calling it dry soap. You pass. In the alley behind the bathhouse, a man offers scented washing stones. They are literally rocks, but he insists they've been blessed by a monk. You decline that too. Eventually you pass a group of children rolling around in a pile of hay. One of them has a smear of soot on his cheek. Another picks at a scab on his elbow. They are filthy, gloriously, unbotheredly filthy. You ask when they last bathed. One shrugs. "Don't need to if it rains," he says. You stop at a well to rinse your hands with the soap you were given earlier. It foams, barely. It smells like rosemary and sadness. Your skin immediately feels tighter, almost dewy, so you consider that a win. You dry your hands on your tunic, which really defeats the point, but here we are. As the sun begins to set, the soap maker's shop glows like a forge. More fat is being rendered. More ash is being stirred. It's disgusting. It's necessary. And honestly, it's one of the few things keeping this town from descending into total sensory anarchy. Back in your room, you set your tiny bar of soap on the windowsill. You feel oddly proud of it, like you've earned it. A symbol of your week spent marinating in medieval funk and learning how humanity clawed its way, grittily, stinkily, toward cleanliness. You curl under your blanket, the scent of wood smoke and lard still lingering on your fingers, and fall asleep dreaming of bubble baths, lavender candles, and soft loofahs that won't remove your skin on contact. You wake up to the faint rustle of fabric and the low hum of women talking just outside your window. For a moment, you lie still, unsure if you're still dreaming. Then you catch a phrase, something about rags and vinegar, and your curiosity wins over your dignity. You roll out of bed, brush the straw from your face, and tiptoe toward the sound like you're sneaking into history. Outside, in the narrow courtyard behind your lodging, a small circle of women are sitting on stools and overturned crates, their skirts bunched around their ankles, their sleeves rolled to their elbows. A pot of water steams nearby, and one woman is holding what looks like a bundle of linen strips. Another is carefully sewing something tiny and lumpy. And just like that, you realise today's story isn't about plague or rats. or monks scrubbing their feet with wine, today it's about the invisible labour of medieval women's hygiene. Let's begin with the big one, menstruation. You knew we were going to get here eventually, and yes, it's going to be weird, but also it's fascinating. Because while historians often write about kings and knights and fields of battle, they don't talk nearly enough about how women managed their bodies in a world with no plumbing, no private bathrooms, and definitely no shelf of store-bought pads at the local general store. Your historical fact of the day: medieval women used a variety of makeshift materials to manage their periods: linen rags, wool pads, moss, or even soft paper if they were rich and fancy. These were washed and reused when possible, and often tied in place with belts or cord. The result was functional, if not comfortable. You sit quietly as the women around you continue their work. One is soaking strips of cloth in vinegar and drying them over a line. Another is twisting wool into a sort of plug. No one's whispering. There's no shame here, just tired hands and quiet conversation. They've done this before, hundreds of times. One woman, a midwife judging by the assortment of herbs in her satchel, begins explaining how she helps girls when they get their first bleed. They think they're dying, she says with a sigh, and sometimes their mothers don't tell them anything at all, so they come to me screaming. She pats a girl on the knee. We teach them how to wrap, how to breathe, how to not be afraid of their own blood. You learn, to your horror and mild fascination, that some women used leather undergarment belts to keep rags in place. Kind of medieval sanitary harness. They weren't comfortable, but they worked. You also learn that in desperate situations, long travel, illness, poverty, some women simply bled into their clothing and changed when they could. In a world already soaked in sweat and grime, a little extra wasn't always noticed. Here's your quirky fact. Medieval medical texts often described menstruation as a form of bodily purging, essential to a woman's health. If a woman stopped bleeding, it was seen as dangerous. Blocked humours, trapped heat, or worse. Some physicians even prescribed leeches to draw out blood when it wasn't flowing naturally. Yep, leeches. Again, they're everywhere. The conversation drifts to childbirth. Another mess entirely. One woman recounts helping a friend deliver her 8th child in the dead of winter with nothing but hot cloths, a sheep's wool blanket, and a carved piece of wood to bite down on. She screamed like the saints were dragging her to heaven, the woman says, but she lived, and so did the baby. That's more than most. Everyone nods, some with relief, some with remembered grief. They talk about hygiene during pregnancy, washing with vinegar, soaking feet in sage, keeping the womb cool. They talk about postpartum bleeding, pelvic pain, infections. Nothing's sugar-coated. It's raw, honest, and full of that gritty wisdom you only get from women who've learned through hard living. You ask if there's anything for cramps. One woman laughs and points to a flask. Strong wine. Another holds up a bundle of dried herbs. Yarrow and mugwort. Boil it. Drink it. Rub it on your belly. And pray it works. You ask if it does. She shrugs. Better than nothing. This brings us to the debate historians still poke at. How much did medieval women really know about their own bodies? Some argue that, despite a lack of formal education, women preserved a rich, practical knowledge through oral tradition, passed from mother to daughter, midwife to apprentice. Others argue that most of what we think we know comes from male-written texts which viewed female hygiene through the distorted lens of sin, shame, and wildly inaccurate anatomy. And yet, here you are, sitting among women who know exactly what's going on. They might not use Latin names or own anatomy books, but they've got hands-on experience. They've made their own solutions, stitched their own rags, and figured out how to stay clean, or at least clean enough, while the rest of the world lost its mind over rats and sin. You follow them as they gather their things, rinse out the used cloths, and hang them to dry behind the bakery where the wind is strongest. They don't hide the cloths. There's no shame in blood here. It's just part of being alive. Back in town, you stop at a merchant stall selling ladies' herbs for monthly troubles. The dried bundles are unmarked, but you recognise some of the names now: mugwort, fennel, sage. The merchant gives you a knowing smile. For your wife? He asks. You nod. No one needs to know. Later you find a young girl sitting alone near the well, hugging her knees. You offer her one of the dried linen cloths from the women earlier. She doesn't speak, just takes it with wide eyes and runs off. Maybe she's new to it. Maybe no one told her what to expect, but now she knows she's not alone. As night falls, the quiet returns. You lay in bed thinking not about kings or plagues or the latest body cart to roll by, but about the quiet strength of women behind closed doors, boiling water, sewing cloth, and bleeding with dignity in a world that rarely noticed. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't clean, but it was constant, and it still is. You fall asleep with the scent of sage and vinegar lingering on your hands, and there's the quiet hum of wisdom passed through generations echoing softly in your ears. You wake up to metal clinking against metal, a slow rhythmic clang echoing through the damp morning air. You sit up, groggy and already regretting life, and peek out your shutter to see a man standing in the alley with a blade in one hand and a bowl of water in the other. His tunic is stained, his hands are steady, and his customer, a wiry older man with half a beard, is gritting his teeth like he's about to give birth to a porcupine. The man raises the blade, grins, and in one quick motion slices open a vein in the guy's arm. You've officially met the barber surgeon, and yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. Today you'll be spending quality time with the person who cuts your hair, pulls your teeth, drains your blood, and maybe, if he's feeling bold, digs around your skull with a rusty spoon, all in one visit. Because here in the 14th century, medicine is very much a choose-your-own-disaster kind of situation. Here's your historical fact to get us started. Barbers in medieval Europe weren't just in charge of grooming, they were also trained in basic surgical procedures, including bloodletting, lancing boils, tooth extraction, and even amputations. The red and white barber pole we still see today, that's a throwback to their original tools, blood and bandages. You step out into the alley just in time to see the old man's blood drip into a wooden bowl. He doesn't scream, just flinches and mutters something about the heat. The barber nods approvingly and presses a wad of cloth to the wound. "You'll feel better in an hour," he says. The patient doesn't look convinced. But hey, what else is he going to do? Visit a real doctor? You strike up a conversation with the barber, who introduces himself as Willick, though everyone calls him the Chin. He offers you a shave, a tooth pull, and a good draining, all for one coin. You decline. Politely. He shrugs. "Suit yourself. You look like you've got too much blood anyway." You can't tell if that's a compliment or a threat. Here's your quirky fact. Bloodletting wasn't just a medical fad, it was a foundational belief. Physicians believed that balancing the body's four humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, was the key to health. Too much blood? You were feverish, irritable, or sinful. The solution? Let some of it out. Carefully, of course, or not. It really depended on the guy holding the knife. Willick invites you to watch his next procedure, a tooth extraction. His patient, a woman in her 40s with cheeks like sun-dried leather, sits on a stool gripping a rag between her teeth. "To soften the pain," she says, "and keep from biting my own tongue off." The barber nods, pulls out a pair of iron tongs that look like medieval salad grabbers, and gets to work. It is, without question, the worst thing you've ever seen. There is blood, there is crunching, there is a sound like someone stepping on gravel. The woman screams once and then immediately apologises. The tooth comes out with a pop, and Willick drops it into a small leather pouch with a dozen others. "You keep the first one," he tells her. "Good luck." The scholarly debate here is particularly juicy. Historians argue over whether barber surgeons were actually helpful, or just enthusiastic butchers with access to sharp tools. Some claim they saved countless lives by draining abscesses, reducing infections, and removing dangerous growths. Others point out that without anesthesia, sterilisation, or germ theory, these procedures often did more harm than good. Sometimes they cut open a patient to cure them, and ended up just introducing more bacteria into their already doomed bodies. You follow Willick back to his shop, which is basically a wooden bench under a canopy beside a butcher stall. He sharpens his knives next to a pile of ox bones. "You get used to the blood," he says, dipping his blades in a bucket of wine to clean them. You try not to visibly flinch. A young boy approaches with a swollen cheek. "Bad tooth," he says, barely opening his mouth. Willick gives him a quick look and nods. 3 sips of wine and you won't feel a thing. This is a lie. The boy chugs, winces, and hands over a copper coin. You walk away before the pliers come out again. In the next alley over, you meet another barber who proudly advertises leeching for lung and liver complaints. He holds up a jar of writhing leeches and explains that each one is carefully placed along the skin to draw out corrupted blood. They are like little monks, when he says, "Suck the sin right out of you." You do not ask what he charges. You do not ask where the leeches have been. Back in the town square, a man with a stitched scalp sits in the sun, sipping watered wine and swearing that Willick saved his life. "I had the sickness," he says, "and then he bled me. Cut the devil right out." You smile and nod. There is no devil, just sepsis. You pass a cart selling surgical ointments, mostly thick pastes made from goose fat, honey, and powdered herbs. They smell like swamp rot and regret. One is labelled for open wounds and inner demons, another is for rot of the toe. You keep moving. As night falls, you return to your room and lie awake listening to distant coughing, and the occasional scream of someone discovering that minor operation actually means major regret. You reach up and touch your own teeth, suddenly grateful for every last one, and maybe that's what barber surgeons offered more than anything. Hope, pain, and the illusion of action. You didn't have to sit in silence, waiting to die. You could do something, bleed, yank, sear, suffer, survive. You fall asleep with the sound of a blade being sharpened in your mind, and a newfound respect for every clean, quiet dental office you've ever taken for granted. You're barely out the door before you hear it. A thick, wet splorch, followed by a loud groan. And then what sounds suspiciously like someone vomiting. Again. You pause mid-step and consider whether you really want to follow that sound. You do, you absolutely do, because today's adventure takes you to the bizarre, the homemade, and the very, very questionable world of folk cures and plague medicine. You've already seen vinegar-soaked rags and lavender bundles, sure. But now you're ready for the next level. Animal guts, powdered toads, and other medical decisions so absurd they feel like pranks played by history itself. You follow the noise around the corner to a grim-looking man hunched over a barrel, holding a piece of cloth to a boy's neck. The boy, probably 12, is blotchy, sweaty, and not doing well. But what really catches your eye is what's tied to his arm. A dead pigeon, just flopped there, limp and ominous. The man notices you staring and says, "Draws the poison." Like that explains everything. Here's your historical fact. One common folk remedy during the Black Plague was to place a freshly killed bird, usually a pigeon, on plague sores in the belief it would absorb the disease. Some texts even instructed people to split the bird open first, and yes, sometimes they used other small animals, like frogs or even snakes. The point wasn't science, it was symbolic transfer. If the bird rotted instead of the person, you were winning. The boy groans again, the pigeon does not. You back away quietly. Across the square, a woman is selling plague amulets, small pouches stuffed with spices, bones, and what she swears is powdered unicorn horn. You ask where she got a unicorn. She squints at you and says, "What are you, a doubter?" You buy a pouch just in case. It smells like mint, dirt, and something unsettlingly sweet. Next to her, a vendor stirs a bubbling pot labelled Plague Draught, guaranteed to rebalance your humours. You peer into the pot and see what looks like turnips, leeks, and possibly a small fish. He offers you a taste. You decline so hard your ancestors feel it. Here's your quirky fact of the day. Some plague remedies involved cutting onions in half and leaving them in corners of the room to trap the disease. People swore that the onions would turn black with infection, saving everyone nearby. Did it work? No. Did it make your home smell like an aggressive salad? Definitely. You wander into a healer's shop, part apothecary, part kitchen, part crypt. Jars line the walls, crushed beetles, dried rose petals, powdered bones. One is labelled Plague Paste, External Use Only. You don't want to know what internal use would mean. The healer, a gaunt man with ink-stained fingers and absolutely no eyebrows, waves you over and offers to sell you a worm poultice. You ask what it's for. "Everything," he says, "especially boils or curses." He unwraps a cloth to reveal a mixture that smells like mouldy cheese and regret. You make a sound your throat wasn't built to make and thank him politely before fleeing into the street. This leads us nicely into the scholarly debate. Did any of this actually work? Surprisingly, yes, some of it. Vinegar had mild antibacterial properties. Burning herbs could reduce fleas. Honey and certain plant extracts may have soothed wounds or prevented infections. But most treatments were guesswork, ritual, or inherited nonsense passed down because someone somewhere wanted it to work. And then there were the truly dangerous cures. You pass a woman selling a mercury vapour treatment involving hot coals and sealed rooms. A young man claims his cousin inhaled the fumes and stopped coughing. You ask if the cousin survived. He hesitates. No, he says, but he stopped coughing. You stop by a tavern where the owner proudly offers lemon wine soaked in crushed pearls, which he calls a nobleman's remedy. You ask if it helps. Helps you forget you're dying, he says cheerfully. It's 5 coins a cup. Back in the poorer district, you come across a group gathered around an old woman, crouched on a stool, mumbling over a boy's fevered body. She's holding a toad by the leg and chanting something about drawing out the heat. Then gently, she places the toad on the boy's stomach and waits. The toad does not seem thrilled. You don't ask what happens next. You learn that some people swallow crushed emeralds for protection. Others smear human excrement on boils to equalize the humours. Someone even tried injecting urine into an open wound once, though the story ends abruptly after that. And yet, beneath all the horror, there's something human here. Desperate, yes. Misguided, absolutely. But human. These folk cures are acts of hope. In a world where plague rips through towns without reason, doing something, anything, feels better than doing nothing. Even if it involves leeches, onions, or a really uncomfortable frog. You pass a small chapel where a nun is handing out sachets of rosemary and garlic. God's medicine, she says. It might not cure you, but it smells better than your neighbour. She gives you one. You nod in thanks. By nightfall, the town smells like vinegar, herbs, and burnt feathers. Every house seems to have its own brew. Someone's boiling a rat in wine down the street. Someone else is painting their walls with egg yolk. One man swears he cured his wife by whispering to her sores for 3 nights in a row. She died on the 4th. You climb into bed with your little pouch of mystery herbs under your pillow. The smell oddly comforting now. You don't know if it works. You don't care. It feels like something. And maybe that's the point. Maybe hope, wrapped in linen and nonsense, is still hope. It's not even dawn when you hear the knock. 3 soft taps on wood, then silence. Then 3 more. You open the door slowly, half expecting a rat in a robe asking for confession. But instead it's a wide-eyed boy, barefoot, breathless, and way too awake for someone living through a plague. They found another body, he says, out near the north wall. They need someone to help. And because you have no boundaries or survival instinct left, you nod and follow. The streets are dark. Not quite night, but nowhere near day. The lamps flicker in protest as you pass, and the cobblestones are slick with something that's definitely not just rain. You arrive at the north wall to find a small group huddled around a limp shape wrapped in burlap. A man leans down, lifts the corner of the cloth and grimaces. You don't look too closely. You've learned by now that curiosity is the quickest path to nausea. You're here for the burial, not the mystery, because today we're talking about how the dead were handled when the living barely had the energy to keep breathing. It's not pretty, it's not dignified, but it's necessary. Your historical fact: during the height of the Black Plague, the death toll overwhelmed burial systems in nearly every affected region. Cemeteries filled within weeks. Graves were dug shallow, then wide. Entire fields were converted into plague pits. In many cities, officials gave up on traditional funerals altogether. The goal became simple: get the bodies underground, fast. You're handed a shovel. Not a greeting, not an explanation, just a shovel. Someone grunts and gestures toward a pit already half dug in the cold morning earth. You dig, because there's not really a polite way to say no to a burial crew. The ground is soft with rain and older rot. The air smells like wet leaves, damp soil, and something sweeter and more sinister beneath. As you dig, a man beside you talks quietly. He was a baker, he says, nodding toward the bundle. Good one too. Didn't water his dough. Gave the kids the crusts. His voice doesn't break. His hands don't shake. He's done this before. A lot. Here comes your quirky fact. Plague carts. Those grim wooden wagons that rolled through towns collecting the dead were often accompanied by bell ringers or criers shouting things like, "Bring out your dead!" Sometimes people would carry their own dead loved ones to the carts. Sometimes they'd toss them out windows. In a few cases, people still breathing were thrown on by mistake, or on purpose. You glance over and see one of the gravediggers tucking a coin into the folds of the dead man's sleeve. For the ferryman, he mutters. Old traditions die hard, even when people do so in bulk. There's debate among scholars about how consistently the dead were treated. Some say bodies were burned. Others say cremation was rare, too expensive, too feared, too symbolically violent. Mass graves or plague pits were the norm. They were dug deep in some places, barely scraped in others. Bodies were layered like lasagna. lime powder between them to suppress the stench and slow decay. Or at least that was the idea. You finish digging. The body is lowered in, no prayers, no names, just a moment of silence and the soft sound of earth hitting cloth. Afterward, you walk with one of the workers, a woman with strong arms and a haunted look. She tells you they've buried over 100 this month. We stopped counting, she adds. Felt like tempting fate. She points toward a fenced area near the edge of town. We call that the hill. Don't go there unless you want to know what death smells like in the sun. Back in the centre of town, you see signs of how the living are trying to honour the dead anyway. Someone's painted small crosses on the walls of plague houses. A child leaves dried flowers outside a boarded-up door. A priest walks silently from home to home, pressing his hand to the wood and whispering blessings no one can hear. You stop at a shrine built from stones and bits of broken pottery. There's no statue, just a crude symbol scratched into the rock, and a handful of coins, herbs and tokens left behind. You add your pouch of unicorn dust to the pile. It didn't help, but it feels right to leave it here. At midday, you pass the carpenter's row and see a man shaping a coffin. It's simple. Pine, no adornments, barely held together with nails. He's making it fast. When you ask who it's for, he shrugs. Not sure yet, he says, but someone will need it. In wealthier neighbourhoods, you hear whispers of special burials. Private ceremonies, blessed soil, engraved stones. But even the rich can't escape the numbers. Eventually, there's just not enough room. You hear that in some towns, bodies were dumped into rivers. Others were left outside city walls. When fear outpaces ritual, all that's left is disposal. You stop for food at a stall near the chapel, flatbread, and something pretending to be cheese. The vendor wears gloves, which you appreciate, until you realise he's been using the same pair all week. You eat anyway. What's one more risk? As dusk approaches, you walk past a group of mourners outside a home marked with a painted black X. They're singing softly, voices low and off-key but heartfelt. You don't understand the words. You don't need to. Grief is multilingual. By the time you reach your room, the stars are just starting to push through the cloud cover. You set down the shovel you didn't mean to keep and scrub your hands with the last sliver of that harsh pine-scented soap. The water runs brown, then pink, then clear. You lie back, arms sore, fingers blistered, and mind strangely quiet. You helped bury someone today. Someone who once baked bread and gave kids the crusts. He deserved more than a hole in the ground and a pigeon to the face, but at least he got something. And maybe that's all the living can do. Remember, witness, dig, and keep breathing. This morning begins with a scream. Not the distant wail of someone discovering a plague sore or the strained yelp of another tooth being pulled in an alley. No, this one is different. Short, sharp, unmistakably horrified. You jump out of bed and nearly trip over your own foot wraps as you rush to the window. And there she is, a young woman, hands to her mouth, staring at what used to be her laundry. Someone, or something, has stolen every single piece except a single sock and a pair of bloomers fluttering in the breeze like a tragic flag of surrender. She's not alone. From the alley, a chorus of grumbles and accusations is already forming. Today, it seems, someone has been stealing clean clothes. In a town like this, that's basically grand larceny. You head downstairs, because obviously this is your business now, and fall into step beside a grizzled older man wearing a robe that looks like it used to be a curtain. They're saying it's the washer folk, he mutters, or the grave diggers, or the nuns, or some out-of-town sneak. You ask why anyone would steal dirty laundry. He stares at you like you've grown an extra nose. It's clean, that's why. Who has clean clothes anymore? And that's when it hits you. We've spent all this time talking about bathing, but what about the thing that hugs your sweaty, fever-racked, rat-fearing body all day long? That's right. Clothing hygiene during the Black Plague, a journey in itch, stench, and unfortunate underwear decisions. Your historical fact for the day. Clothes were rarely washed, especially outer garments. Linen underclothes might get laundered every few weeks if you were lucky, but wool, silk, and anything dyed or embroidered was considered too delicate to scrub. Instead, people beat the dust out, brushed the lice off, maybe aired it in the sun, and hoped the smell wouldn't knock out any passing monks. You follow a trail of scandal to the riverbank, where the washerwomen have gathered in defence mode. One stands waist deep in the water, holding up a pair of stained breeches like it's evidence in a trial. "Does this look like nobleman's laundry?" she yells. These belong to a shepherd. I can still smell the goats. Turns out there's a full-on town meeting forming around the issue, complete with yelling, finger-pointing, and at least one man accusing a goose. As you squeeze into the crowd, someone tries to sell you a linen chemison, guaranteed flea-free. You decline, mostly because you don't want to know how he knows that. Here's your quirky fact. Medieval people often smoked their clothes to disinfect them, hanging them over aromatic fires of rosemary, thyme, or juniper. Did it work? Maybe a little. At least it masked the scent of despair. Others tried rubbing their garments with vinegar, soaking them in stale urine, or, if they were fancy, beating them with lavender sticks. You're not sure what lavender ever did to deserve that. You wander over to the tailor's row, where the mood is less scandalous but significantly itchier. A woman is picking lice from her shawl with the help of a sharp comb and a look of eternal regret. "You don't wash wool," she mutters. "It'll shrink, fall apart, ruin everything." Instead, she bakes it in the sun. Kills the fleas, sometimes. You decide not to ask what happens the rest of the time. A tailor nearby shows you a coat lined with fur that once belonged to a nobleman. It's stiff with old sweat, powdered with flea dirt, and smells like boiled mutton and fear. "I aired it out for a week," he says proudly. You nod slowly, then back away. Now for the debate, because of course there's one. Scholars still argue about how often people actually cleaned their clothes, and how much hygiene was prioritised during plague outbreaks. Some believe people became hyper-vigilant, scrubbing linen more often, boiling undergarments, and burning contaminated fabric. Others argue that fear of water, lack of soap, and sheer exhaustion meant people wore clothes until they rotted off, sometimes quite literally. Back in the main square, the accusations are growing more dramatic. One man insists his shirt was taken by angels. A woman swears she saw a cloaked figure vanish into a stable with a bundle of socks. Meanwhile, a child proudly shows off a pair of trousers clearly 3 sizes too big. No one questions it. The bar is on the floor. You stop for lunch near a dyer's shop where racks of cloth are hanging to dry. Bright blues, dull greens, reds so faded they look like old rust. The smell of dye, pungent, acidic, a little like pickled beetroot, clings to everything. You learn that some dyes, like woad or madder, were thought to repel disease. Others were just expensive enough that wearing them made you feel protected by sheer social status. You watch as one woman rubs her apron with a cut lemon, murmuring that it keeps the fleas away. Her friend disagrees. "It's the colour," she says. "Right things keep the plague spirits from touching you." Neither one seems entirely sure, but they keep scrubbing. Back in your room, you decide to do what very few plague tourists have ever dared. Wash your shirt. It's rough-spun linen, stained, smelly, and beginning to form its own opinions about things. You find a bucket, fill it with water from the well, you're feeling lucky, and add a little vinegar, a sprig of thyme, and what might be soap. You dunk the shirt. It protests. You scrub. You question your life choices. You hang it on the windowsill and hope the wind doesn't carry it away. Later you lie on your straw mattress in your undershirt, the scent of vinegar still in your nose. Outside, the town is quieting down, the mystery of the stolen laundry unresolved but mostly forgotten. Another body was found near the granary. And priorities have shifted again. But for a brief moment, people argued not about death, but about socks, about who touched whose tunic, and whether washing wool was a crime. They shouted, they laughed, they accused geese. It was almost normal. You fall asleep wondering if your shirt will be dry by morning. You kind of hope it isn't. It'll mean another day without putting it back on. You wake up to the sound of hooves on cobblestones and something that, at first, you mistake for singing. It's too early for singing. Your brain is foggy. Your shirt is still damp from yesterday's heroic attempt at laundry, and your mouth tastes like you've been chewing on parchment. But then you realise, it's not singing, it's chanting, rhythmic, deliberate, and punctuated by a high metallic jingle every few beats. You peek out the window and see a procession moving slowly through the main street. At the front walks a line of robed figures, some in grey, others in rough brown wool, faces hidden under hoods. Behind them, women in veils and children in patched tunics march silently. At the very back, 2 boys swing a smoking censer between them, the sweet, choking scent of frankincense curling into the dawn air. Today, your final chapter in this delightful plague vacation is about ritual, specifically how people used religion, superstition, and performance to reclaim a sense of control over their hygiene, their health, and their slow, spiralling world. Your historical fact: during the Black Plague, religious processions like the one you're watching were common across Europe. Some were sanctioned by the church, others not so much. They ranged from solemn public prayers to full-on performative spectacles involving relics, holy water, and that one guy who insisted on carrying a dead dove tied to a stick. You throw on your second damp shirt, gag slightly at its pickled scent, and head downstairs. The procession is passing by the square now, and more people have joined. Not because they believe it will stop the plague, though some still cling to that, but because it's something to do, something that feels purposeful. You notice a man dipping his fingers in a bucket of blessed vinegar and flicking it toward the crowd. A child clutches a wooden cross painted with tiny red flowers. An old woman mumbles a prayer, clutching a bone that you hope belongs to a goat, and you find yourself standing next to a friar who's covered in dust and smells like he's spent the last 3 weeks in a cellar. He carries a bundle of dried herbs tied to his waist and wears a lead medallion shaped like a hand. You ask what it's for. He shrugs. Protection, or balance, or both. Then he adds, with a crooked grin, or maybe just fashion. He winks, and her moves on. Here's your quirky fact. Many people during plague years wore charms, talismans, or even full-on costumes designed to protect them from illness. Some stitched phrases into their clothing. Latin prayers, protective symbols, or the name of a favourite saint. Others carried amulets made from gemstones, bones, or twisted bits of metal. One woman in Florence supposedly wore a necklace made from dried bat wings. It didn't work, but it was memorable. You follow the procession to the edge of town, where it breaks into smaller groups. Some kneel in the dirt, others light candles and place them at the foot of a stone cross. A few begin singing, not chants now, but soft, almost lullaby-like songs that carry in the breeze. You sit on a nearby stump and take it in. This brings us to the scholarly debate. Did these rituals actually help anyone survive the plague? The rational answer is no. No amount of singing or ash crossing could stop a bacterium carried by flea-infested rats. But the deeper truth is more complicated. Rituals offered structure, repetition, comfort, a way to make sense of chaos. In that sense, they did help. Not the body, maybe, but the spirit. You walk back through the town and see how ritual has soaked into every corner of daily life now. People sprinkle salt across thresholds. They tie cloths around tree trunks with whispered wishes. Some leave bread offerings in alleys for the wandering dead. A woman in the market swears by walking 3 circles around her cottage before sleep. Her neighbour insists on pouring water over her doorstep every morning to keep the sickness from sticking. It's not always religious. Sometimes it's just human. Someone scrawls a poem on a wall and people stop to read it. Another hangs fresh rosemary from every window of her house. A child builds a tiny altar out of broken tiles and flowers and places a dead mouse on top. You don't ask. You pass by a public well where people are washing their hands in wine. Not because it works, but because someone said it might. A monk nearby whispers a blessing over each person as they pass. You watch as a man dips his hands, flinches, and smiles. Stings, he says, so it must be doing something. Later you wander into a small chapel. It's quiet, empty except for a single candle burning near the altar, and a woman kneeling with her hands clasped tight enough to turn her knuckles white. She doesn't notice you. You don't disturb her. Outside the chapel, people are carving names into wooden boards. Names of the lost, the sick, the saved. It's not official, it's not organised, but it's something. As dusk falls, you climb a small hill just outside the town walls. From there you can see the rooftops stretching out in rows of grey and red and soot. Smoke rises from chimneys. Someone is banging a pot in the distance, part of a new ritual to drive out the disease. It's loud, it's absurd, it's strangely comforting. You sit there as the sky turns deep purple and think about everything you've seen. The fear, the filth, the vinegar-soaked everything, but also the persistence, the way people reach for patterns when the world breaks apart, the way they find order in the stink and the sores and the silence, even if it's just washing your shirt once a week, lighting a candle, hanging lavender over a door, even if it doesn't work, because maybe the point isn't whether it works, maybe the point is that we try. You head back into town, past the chapel, past the empty square, past the laundry line where your shirt still flutters, stubbornly damp. You lie down in your straw bed one last time, with the faint sound of chanting in your ears and the scent of rosemary smoke drifting in through the cracked shutter. And for the first time in a long time, You don't dream of rats or saws or death wagons. You dream of soft linen and warm water and hands that still believe in healing. So now you're lying there, tucked under a blanket that smells faintly of straw and smoke, your back sore from a week of watching history fumble its way through one of the worst disasters in human memory. You've trudged through alleyways dripping with gutter slime, shared vinegar handbaths with coughing bakers, dodged pigeons tied to plague saws, and watched someone get their molar yanked out with iron tongs and a prayer. You've seen the wild extremes of hygiene during the Black Plague, when cleanliness was a gamble, bathing could kill you, or so they thought, and hope came wrapped in garlic, herbs, or a dead toad stitched into your shirt. And yet somehow you're still breathing. Which is more than most people could say back then. This journey wasn't about finding soap and water miracles or medieval hand sanitizer. It was about something much messier and far more human. It was about the rituals and routines we cling to when the world starts falling apart. Washing your shirt with vinegar even though it won't help. Tying rosemary above your door because your neighbour swears it worked for her cousin's aunt. Letting a barber cut your arm open to balance your humours because it feels better than doing nothing at all. You've seen the difference between survival and sanity. The first requires luck. The second, that's where the rituals come in, where every lavender sachet, every hot vinegar rinse, every onion placed carefully on a windowsill becomes a small rebellion against hopelessness. And honestly, isn't that what hygiene really was back then? Not just about staying clean, but about staying human. So before you drift off, before the chanting fades, before the bells ring again, before someone tries to sell you flea powder made from powdered emeralds, take a moment. Appreciate your warm shower, your clean socks, your toothpaste that doesn't taste like chalk and regret. And maybe tomorrow light a candle or hang some lavender just because. Not for the germs, but for the comfort. That quiet little I'm still here. Now close your eyes, the town is quiet, the plague carts have passed, the candle flickers low, and even if it's just for tonight, everything feels a little bit cleaner. Sleep well, time traveller. You made it.